This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
5 minutes after 10 is the time. You'll be hearing a lot more about Make Some Noise today, but just allow me a moment to tell you why I hold it so close to my heart. It really does reach places that other fundraising drives cannot reach. It focuses exclusively and specifically upon charities that don't really have marketing budgets or advertising spends, because they're small and they're bespoke and they're focused on very specific areas, and all the money that they raise, all the money that they receive goes on the work that they do. I don't know where the threshold is for charities, and it's not a criticism of the ones that are big enough to have, chuggers out on the street trying to sign you up to a subscription, or big billboards all over the place, or their own shops, their own retail outlets. There's a threshold, isn't there? Which charities dedicate quite a lot of their energies to raising money, as much as spending it on the people that need help. Make Some Noise moves into the spaces that are normally quite lonely. It moves into the charity spaces that are normally quite isolated. The small organisations, the charities that deal with local projects, specific problems. And I've got to tell you, as someone who has the incredible privilege occasionally of handing over the cash, handing over the checks, I always think of Emlyn Hughes. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. When I was a kid, I met Emlyn Hughes, the Liverpool and England football player. I can't remember what the charity event was, but the local paper used to have those giant checks. Like the massive checks, you'd be shaking hands. I've done that. I've visited charities and actually handed over the photo opportunity check. And the difference that it makes to the lives of people who are often volunteers, the difference that it makes is absolutely extraordinary. So what I want you to do is donate, and you do so, as I've just explained, by simply texting LBC 40 to give £40, LBC 30 to give £30, and LBC 20 altogether now to give £20. You send it to 70766, no spaces. LBC 40, LBC 30, LBC 20, no space, to 70766. All right? 7 minutes after 10 is the time. I want to begin with a simple question about capital gains tax. And it's not the sexiest phone-in introduction that you've ever heard, is it? What are we going to talk about today? Capital gains tax. But I really like this because I find it really difficult to credit that our entire society, for I think as long as any of us have been alive, has taken more money out of the earnings of people working than it has out of the profits of people benefiting from already being wealthy. It's being presented, obviously, depending on where you're getting your news, as a decision Rachel Reeves will take between about 33% and 39%. Treasury modelling that the Chancellor is currently looking at. The Guardian newspaper has seen it, and that shows that officials are testing a range of 33% to 39% for capital gains tax. It only affects about 350,000 people, and it is applied to the sale of assets such as second homes and shares. And I can't quite believe the status quo on this. How often do you realise that you don't pay that much attention, or you don't pay enough attention to the stuff that is going on around you? I mean, the idea that you go to work every day, and the chances are, if you're earning above or around the national average, then the tax that you pay, the percentage of tax that you pay on some of your income, on most of your income, will be a higher percentage than I would pay as a top-rate taxpayer if, for example, I had a second home, a holiday home, or a buy-to-let investment. Imagine I'd bought a house and rented it out to other people for 10 years, and I bought it for, let's say, £250,000, right? And I sold it for £500,000. On that £250,000 profit, that money that I have earned for doing absolutely nothing except being wealthy enough to buy a house in the first place, I've let a lettings agency deal with all the gubbins. I've just sat back smoking a cigar while somebody else pays off the mortgage that I took out to borrow the place to buy the place in the first place. I've made 250 grand clear. I pay less tax in percentage terms on that 250 grand than you do on your salary this year. How can that be right? How can that be right? 24% on gains from residential property. This doesn't apply to your main home. No one's coming after your house. All right? This doesn't apply to your main home. This applies only to residential properties that you own as an investment, or possibly inheritance tax is slightly different. If you have an investment fund, if you manage an investment fund, 28% profit on that, 28% tax on the profits that you make from that. And if you have shares and other assets, then it's 20%. That's for a top rate taxpayer. If your income tax is lower, if you're in a lower rate as a taxpayer, then some of these numbers come down. Wealth managers have reported a flurry of investors rushing to sell second homes. Well, that's great news, isn't it? Because we've got a housing shortage in this country. That will free up housing stock for people who are keen to own their own homes and live in them, as opposed to own second homes and largely not live in them, and indeed other assets. This is all in expectation of an announcement in the budget. And I understand. I think it was it? Ian tells me that Nigel Lawson equalised capital gains tax and income tax in about 1989, and it stayed like that until 2008. I don't know, and that's the point I'm trying to make, possibly a slightly self-excusing, self-exculpating point about not paying that much attention to what is going on around us. So I think this is not only a brilliant policy. I think it reeks of natural justice. One of the quibbles is that the money with which you bought the house in the first place is money on which you were already taxed. But you're not getting taxed on that twice. You're only getting taxed on essentially the profit that you've made, or the area in which you've moved into on gains from residential property. So I don't think that's relevant, Lisa. It's texted already. Didn't you buy the house with income earned and taxed already? Yes, but the gains that you've made on the residential property is what will be taxed, not the stuff that you've paid for already, the price of the house. If you don't make any profit on it whatsoever, then this capital gains tax doesn't kick in. It's the gains that you make on the residential property. So I think that's probably a slightly Daily Mail flavoured deception that has been put out there. And it only affects 350,000 people. If they go to the top rate, if they go to 39% on this, the estimate is they could raise about £1 billion. As it stands, 350,000 people each year pay capital gains tax, and that constitutes about £15 billion in tax receipts. So if they raise it to 33%, they'll raise a few hundred million more, according to this modelling. And if they raise it to about the middle of the range, not the top, it will raise about £1 billion. And if they go right to the top, well, it will raise more, although it could then fall off with people essentially avoiding the necessity of paying for it. I just want to know what you think about this. And listen, it's a different phone-in for us, this. It's about simply whether or not you should pay more money on profits from assets, a higher percentage, than you do on income. So if I was one of these 350,000 people, and I have been in the past, I don't think I will be this year, is it really fair that you are paying more tax in percentage terms on your hard-earned income than I would be on the cream that I'm scraping from the top of my share portfolio or property empire? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. I'd quite like you to argue with me on this, if you like, in the sense that I'm being a bit naive and a bit undergraduate. My politics can sometimes be a bit idealistic, if you like, a bit simplistic. And I obviously no surprises to learn that I'm a high-rate taxpayer. And on some of this stuff, I don't have a second home, but on some of this stuff, I would be hit quite hard at some sort of point, unspecified point in the future. But I can't quite see how anyone could argue this is fair. as it stands, that you pay a lower percentage on the cream you scrape off the top of your investment portfolio than the people working for the companies delivering the share dividends do on their daily grind, on their daily graft. So I don't know that I'm missing something, but if you think that the moral case is nowhere near as black and white or as clear as it seems to be to me, then you know what to do. Or I'll tell you what else I do. Isn't this what Labour governments are supposed to do? You know, they're not soaking the rich. They're just spreading the burden a little bit more fairly. I've always felt, particularly with buy-to-let mortgages, and I know that and I was a buy-to-let landlord for a while, by accident. Not by accident. It's not like Withnell and I going on holiday by mistake. I needed to buy the house that we were moving into, and I hadn't sold the house that we were moving out of, and we were able to juggle our finances, expecting to sell the previous house quite quickly after moving into the second house, and instead it became a sort of rental situation, a rental investment for a few years. And I'm aware of the fact that not all buy-to-let landlords are sharks or vampires or anything of the sort. But the profit that you would make for doing nothing should surely be taxed at a higher rate, or at least as a comparable rate to the tax that you pay for your blood, sweat and tears. That's where I worry that I'm being a bit simplistic, because it seems to me to be such an unfair system, such an obviously unjust system, that essentially sees you make a smaller contribution to the public purse out of money that you're getting for nothing. Money comes of money, money made from money, literally money made from money, than you are on money made from blood, sweat and toil. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 1017.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I wasn't expecting to get a chuckle so early out of a phone-in as potentially, well, it's a tax phone-in, but a former, let me get this job description correct, a former president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, no less, a former His Majesty's Inspector of Taxes, has already tweeted, I think probably fairly, but a little unkindly, Ray. Great news, tax peeps. At Mr. James O'B is discussing capital gains tax right now on LBC. What could possibly go wrong? Answer, I could probably embarrass myself with my lack of understanding and my slightly undergraduate approach to fiscal fairness. It seems to me, let me use me as an example, okay? So if I had a beautiful second home that now the kids are growing up, we don't use anymore, so I'm selling it. It seems to me a bit ridiculous that the percentage of tax I would pay on the profits on that second home would be lower than the percentage of tax that I pay on my income, on my hard-earned salary. Well, not that hard-earned. Michael's in Ascot. To kick things off, Michael, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Thanks for the show.
You're very welcome.
In my understanding is that the reason capital gains was always being lower than income tax has to encourage people to sell assets. So, for example, if you make it the same as higher rate income tax, and 39% it almost is, people defer selling the asset. Therefore, the tax take is substantially lower to the exchequer. And they are alternative models that are in the public domain.
Well, it hasn't always been like that. Nigel Lawson aligned capital gains tax rates with marginal income tax rates.
You did, you're right.
And it was Gordon Brown who got rid of what I think is called indexation allowances.
Yes, a prudent chancellor. You're dead right. Yeah, the reason it's always been made attractive has to encourage people to sell the asset. And lastly, the other reason it's been made attractive at that lower rate has to encourage people to declare it.
How do you mean?
Well, if it's an elective tax after all. For example, if you're just a PAYE, if you're a PAYE employee,
yeah.
You know it's taken care of. If it's down to an individual to declare the tax, they can delay the declaring it and so on.
Is that a real reason that people would be breaking the law if you made it too high? I mean, that's fine. Let them break it, and I'll use some of the money I've raised to track them down and punish them.
Well, a great example of that, if you look at small businesses, for example, there's massive deviation in tax there as well, in terms of what people
Yeah, but we're not looking at that. I'm not buying that as. I mean, it may be the reason historically, but I'd deal with it. I'd send you all to jail overnight. There you go. That's solved that problem. Speak to me about natural justice, about the idea that somebody who is putting in an almighty shift at the coalface is potentially paying a greater proportion of their income to the Treasury than the person who is living off the cream of his labour, the sweat from his brow, the person whose shared dividends or whose property investment is the rent that this hardworking person is paying, all profit when you sell.
I don't disagree, James. I think it's only fair that a pound earned is taxed equally.
Yeah.
Across whether it's capital gain or income.
But it won't even be that because the top rate is still going to be higher. The top rate of income is still going to be higher than the top rate. So you're giving me a bit of historical context.
Yeah, not many people are in that area, but I agree. A pound's a pound, and it should be taxed as that. However, I'm just saying it was made attractive to declare it and to sell
that's
assets,
interesting,
and that was the reason for it.
And here's the funny thing, though, because I see that as quite a left-wing. Well, not left-wing. I see that as quite I suppose a left-wing move in that the rich should shoulder more of the burden than everybody else, which makes it odd that it was a Labour Chancellor who went back on what a Conservative Chancellor had done. Am I missing something there? That wasn't a rhetorical question. Perhaps I'm not. I don't know. Thank you, Michael. Simon is in Barnet. Simon, what would you like to say? Oh, I think my phone lines have gone funny. Oh, we were doing so well because I think that Michael was probably still talking as well. So how are we going to play this, Keith? Am I just going to burble away and you'll give me a quick heads up when we think the phone lines are working again, or are we going to put some calls through to the studio and just cross our fingers and chance our arm, or should I take this opportunity? Apparently, it normally only lasts a couple of seconds. We've got so much business in the studio today with Make Some Noise, Global's Make Some Noise, that I'm not really minded to retreat to the cubbyhole from which we did the programme yesterday. That's why there were no video clips of yesterday's show available, in case that left an enormous hole in your life. But I do want to stay in this studio because we've got so many guests coming in. But obviously, we are in the lap of the gods. Let's try Simon in Barnet. Simon in Barnet, can you hear me?
Good morning, James. Can you hear me?
Well, I can hear you. In fact, that was never the problem. The problem was you hearing me. No, me hearing you. But anyway, here we are. Quickly, before the phone line goes down again, what did you ring in to tell me?
Okay, so good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I'm a first-time caller, a little bit nervous.
It's only me. It's only me. Welcome.
Okay, so look, just for full transparency, I'm a property owner. I've got a couple of properties myself. I would say I'm a high-tax earner. Yeah. I'm in the process of selling a property at the moment, one that is going to be very profitable for us. We are going to pay capital gains tax on it, but in a nutshell, I think it's the right thing to do for me to pay more tax on that. And I know it's crazy because people say you're mad.
No, I don't. Mate, paying tax is a patriotic act. It's hard to think of a more patriotic thing that most of us get the chance to do in our lives.
And I'm of the same ilk, to be honest with you. Look, I've been very fortunate in my career. I've been a high earner. I've worked all around the world. I live in a nice house. I've got kids in private school. And we use some of our net income to, venture into the property market, and it's been, pretty fruitful for us. I'm selling it up because interest rates have gone crazy, so the yields have come down.
Right.
And the capital gains tax that I'm going to pay off, I've done all my calculations. Me and my wife are going to do okay out of it. We're going to do pretty well. If you told me I'm going to have to pay another 3, 4, 5% tax on it, to be honest with you, James, I wouldn't mind.
Because it feels fair, right?
Correct.
And that is, I mean, it's odd that you think that, because I think there's more people out there like you than perhaps we realise. It's just that so much of the coverage is tailored to protect the interests of wealth, and yet you can. It's not like they're coming after you for everything, is it? You'll still be well off. You'll still be comfortably off. You'll still be better off than that fella over there. You'll still be simply by dint of qualifying for capital gains tax. You're going to be in the more comfortable side of the population. But the idea that you pay a smaller percentage on a pound gained than you do on a pound earned just seems a little bit wrong. Good for you, mate. Seriously, I think were I in your situation, I hope I would be as patriotic as you are. And I don't use that word very often because it's been so horribly abused, largely by racists over the years. But Ben puts it brilliantly. Paying tax is a patriotic act. All these fake patriots should be banging on non-stop about paying their fair share. I notice on my social media feed, Kirsty Allsop has chipped in as well. I think think is a response to the thing I tweeted earlier from the fella that used to be president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. And she says, I'm sick of this hold mode. Can we just get this over with so that people can make their decisions? And Kirsty, of course, knows a heck of a lot about the property market and the property business. It's very clearly impacting the housing market. Nothing is moving and so many businesses are just waiting. Well, I presume, Kirsty, that it would be the budget that everybody is waiting for. And I don't think they can jump the gun on the budget. Again, it's perfectly possible. I'm never less confident than I am on phone-ins like this and issues like this. It's perfectly possible that I am being ignorant or that I'm missing something. But I don't think you can make an announcement before the budget about something that may turn out to be one of the biggest elements of the budget. So a little more patience, I think. Simon Topman, Mark's in Virginia Water. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thank you for taking my call. Nervous as usual.
Yeah, don't be silly. It's only me.
No, we pay taxes. I don't have a problem. We're double tax. One is CGT and the other one is income tax. There are two prongs to this attack. One is the government HMRC removed the Section 24 tax relief. You're now taxed on turnover and not allowed to claim off the bank borrowing interest you pay to the banks. You're actually taxed on interest you pay on your loan to enable you to buy these investment properties.
Right.
What I feel the government has done wrong here is...
that's not capital gains tax, though.
No.
So that's what... I mean, you're describing a slightly more complicated financial situation. We're having I think a necessarily straightforward conversation about the fairness or otherwise of capital gains tax.
Yes, it's unfairness because it's actually classified. This is a main income. Now, there's two incomes. One is passive income. The other one is actually you working at it, and
yes.
We're actually working at it because we have a portfolio. But you've not
given... that income is your rent then. Not as the asset appreciates. That's not active income. That's passive income.
It's passive income, but is it passive income?
Yes.
It's business when it comes to when the HMRC wants to tax you. It's a business.
No, mate. Because I mean, listen. If there were a realistic chance of your properties going down in value, and I appreciate there have been property crashes in the past and there have been wobbles, but for reasons that I doubt either of us fully understand, for the last 20 or 30 years, it's been the safest bet in the world, really, bricks and mortar in this country. So you're not exposing yourself to any risk at all, and the appreciation of your asset is entirely passive. It's going to go up in value whether you're there or not.
You sacrifice to actually acquire these investments, James. And
what do you sacrifice?
You instead of taking your money and live it up and enjoy it, you plow it back into the investment.
But if you were living it up and enjoying it, you'd be paying VAT, you'd be paying all sorts of taxes on it.
Yes, but you're already paying tax on the turnover, and you now...
Well, that's on profits. That's a tax on your business. That's a tax on your active income. You get, mate, your property is going up in value while if you sat there twiddling your thumbs, you could be sitting on the sofa in your pants, Mark, and the tax and then there's someone over the road who's working 50 hours a week and he's paying a higher percentage of his income in tax than you are for sitting on the sofa in your pants just watching your properties go up in value.
No, James, you're not sitting on your sofa smoking the cigar.
You are.
You're actually working.
No, but the property would go up in value even if you were doing that. So the money you get for the rent coming in, that's you being a landlord, looking after a property, making clever decisions, tidying up the garden. I don't know.
Cleaning the toilets.
Get all of that. But the money, the value of the property going up, that's passive.
It might be passive, but
what you're doing, without realising it, you're arguing that you should be paying national insurance on this income as well because it's actually work.
Yeah, do you know what? I wish we could then classify it as a business instead of classify it as passive income, because in that case, they should then allow the interest you pay the bank. You are actually...
But now you're changing. That's a different issue. That's a different issue.
Well, I did say at the beginning, James, that there are two attacks to this, two prongs.
Well, I don't think it's an attack. I think it's an invitation to you to make a patriotic contribution to the public purse from money that, to quote Dire Straits, it's money for nothing.
You are making a patriotic investment because you're paying tax on the rental coming in, but you're not allowed.
I think it should be 50%, Mark. Your mission to this programme has failed completely. You're persuading me it should be even higher.
Oh, I could cry.
50%. 50%. You better hang up quickly before it goes up to 55.
I hope not. I hope this is some sense. I think they should look at discrimination on this.
Okay. I mean, again, it's going to be a budget. I wouldn't want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'll tell you that for nothing. It's a producer said this morning, that's got to be a bit of a headache, hasn't it, being Chancellor of the Exchequer? And you're not wrong. I can't please any of the people any of the time, it would seem. But I quite like this. It appeals to my undergraduate heart. 0345 6060 973. An important message from Roddy, who says smoking a cigar in your pants is not recommended. That's a very good point. Ash could go anywhere. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
36 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need to contribute to a conversation about capital gains tax. Why? I mean, who's the historian here? Who's the fiscal historian? Because if I said to you that Nigel Lawson, who latterly in his life, of course, became better known for being one of the sort of ringleaders of climate change denialism, but is widely regarded as a seminal chancellor, Nigel Lawson put capital gains tax at the same rate as your income tax. So if the money that you made in profit from what you own, apart from your main home, you pay the same percentage. And then Gordon Brown attached it. As far as I can tell, and I am, as I say, I'm so conscious of my ignorance when I veer into territory like this. Imagine how rich I'd be if I actually understood any of this stuff. So that doesn't make sense to me. Does anyone want to have a crack at explaining that? How come it was a Tory Chancellor that did what I seem to see as the most fundamentally fair thing, and then a Labour Chancellor that undid it? Chris is in Maida Vale. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning.
Hello.
I really just wanted to say that, I mean, rather predictably on tax, because obviously it's quite a complicated subject, the media are slightly being simplistic and misrepresenting things.
You don't have to be polite. It's not the whole media. It's just me.
No. Frankly, I could look at all of the broadsheets and I would say exactly the same thing.
Fair enough.
The reality is that in the 1980s, there used to be something called an indexation allowance.
That was Lawson.
Yes. Put simply, what that did was compensate for inflation. You used to have little tables calculating the increase in the retail price index. And basically, what the substance was that if you had a gain, part of it might be a real gain, but part of it might be an inflationary gain.
Oh, okay, yes.
And the point being, you would not be taxed on that inflationary gain.
Okay.
Now, if you look at, for example, what the Institute of Fiscal Studies have been saying, have published in writing, and have got, and have done a podcast this week on the topic.
Yes.
What Paul Johnson, who's been chairing it, and Helen Miller, who's their tax expert, has been leading it, what they've basically been saying is, yes, by all means, it might be appropriate to increase the rate of capital gains tax, but that has to be done in conjunction with what they describe as essentially reforming the asset base. And what Helen Miller of the IFS means by reforming the asset base is that she wants part of the gain to be tax-free,
right.
Okay? And the part of the gain that she wants to be tax-free, she has, and this might be a bit geeky for your listeners.
Go on, I'm enjoying it so far.
Okay, well, essentially what you would do is calculate what is a normalized return by basically looking at a risk-free rate of return, which you would get from the gilt market. So you would take a risk-free rate, which might be...
So that would be your allowance, as it were. That would be your tax-free allowance.
Exactly. So what you would do...
Well, that makes sense.
You would take the cost of your asset, you would gross it up by a hurdle rate. If you were taking the IFS's approach, a risk-free rate of return in the gilt market right now is, say, 4.5%.
Right.
And you would gross it up by that. in the old days under Lawson, you would gross it up for inflation. It clearly is wrong that if there is an inflationary gain, that would be taxed, and it would diminish, the purchasing power of your money and your ability to buy another asset. So very, very critically, the IFS would say, and if Paul Johnson was here, he would not dispute what I'm saying.
No, I don't.
He would basically sort of say, yes, it might be appropriate to increase the rate of capital gains tax, but not by itself. You have to have some type of allowance for either inflation
for both inflation and that kind of profit or that return that you would have received in a risk-free market.
In a risk-free environment.
I think. I'd be tempted to argue, and I don't. I mean, you're very good at explaining things. Are you in this business yourself? Are you an accountant or something similar to that?
Well, when I was a boy, I trained as an accountant. It was a long time ago.
That's why it's still there.
I'm slightly older than you, James.
You can take the boy out of accountancy, Chris, but you can't take the accountancy out of the boy.
True, never leaves you.
Never leaves you.
Once a geek, always a geek.
We could have a little argument now about whether or not property in Britain in this part of the 21st century is actually a risk, an even vaguely risky investment. But today's not the day for that. Have we got any reason? And I think that podcast you refer to is actually available on the Global Player. Have we got any reason to believe that Rachel Reeves will or won't accommodate some of this when she finally gets around to delivering this blooming budget? Well,
okay, you might say she's had several years to write a budget. Some might say she's had 4 months to write a budget. Yes. What the IFS are talking about is quite a radical and philosophical overhaul of capital gains tax.
Right.
It's not tinkering at the margin. And
so it might not be a first budget mission, but it might be a second or third budget mission.
What they debated actually on the podcast is frankly whether for a radical overhaul there would need to be a consultation. And so you couldn't just necessarily announce changes overnight on something like this. You might have to consult. And how practically would you do that? Because obviously as soon as you flag something, we all change our behaviour.
Well, exactly that. And that's what Kirsty Allsop was referring. I can't believe how interesting I have found this entire conversation. I don't think it's geeky at all. I mean, either you are a natural communicator or I'm getting old. I don't know whether there's a sort of geekishness osmosis underway. I think, is the podcast called IFS Zooms In, the economy?
I just went onto YouTube and
I think it is. No, it is, and it's available on the player. So I mean, it is obviously more complicated than some of my analysis allows, and you have explained brilliantly why, without actually puncturing the point of the fundamental question of fairness, which is simplistic by definition. And it does seem a little unfair that inflation wouldn't be taken into account. Do you know why, Chris? While I have you, why Gordon Brown unhitched the parity between capital gains tax rates and income tax rates?
Well, at the time, I think Gordon Brown introduced some form of taper relief. So, in other words, the longer you hold the assets, the lower the rate you would pay. I think that was Gordon Brown who introduced taper relief at the same time. So these things they're not entirely straightforward. There are multiple components to them. The other thing about the podcast, actually, obviously the IFS are leading thinkers on tax from an economic perspective, but Dan Needle participates in some of their podcasts, and obviously Dan Needle is a big tax campaigner. And Dan Needle used to be a corporate tax partner at Clifford Chance, one of the Magic Circle law firms.
In a way, he's a gamekeeper turned poacher.
Well, interestingly as well, he's also a member of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And Rachel Reeves, one would think, or her spads, should be listening to what people like Dan have to say.
What is he saying in a nutshell, Chris, if you would?
Well, he participated in the same podcast, and whilst it was Helen of the IFS who was really advocating for the grossing up of the cost to compensate, for illusory gains. Dan Needle didn't disagree with that.
Okay.
And Dan Needle's got the history on things like indexation allowance, which he fed into the debate.
I think, crikey, you could get a job if you ever need a side hustle. You could get a job as a podcast promoter, I think, because I suspect that their numbers are going to have enjoyed quite a bounce today. And I shall urge you to listen to it via the Global Player, of course, which is the same medium through which you can listen to this programme and rewind live radio. That was really good. That was really interesting. I don't know why I sound so surprised. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:48 is the time. This is a public service announcement for Ricky in Sheppey, all right, and anyone else who's in the same position as Ricky. And I can fully understand how you might have ended up in that position. I forget sometimes that I am, for many people, I am just background noise. You do not hang upon my every syllable with the care and attention that, frankly, you should. So I'm going to read this quickly from Ricky. Me and my wife upsized as we have two boys and we needed a bigger home. Our mortgage is almost crippling us, but we work very hard to pay it and provide a nice life for our family. When the boys leave the nest and eventually we can downsize again, why should we be taxed on the hard work we've put in to provide a nice family home? If we are lucky enough to make a profit on our home, that should just be ours. It will be. That's your residential property. None of the stuff we've been talking about up until this point it includes your main home, your residential property, the place what you live in. So my bad there, Ricky. If you've listened to the first 45 minutes of the show and come away thinking it would be your house, that's actually my fault. I'm not going to put the blame on you for listening wrong. I'm putting all the blame on me for presenting wrong. So you can relax. It will not affect you in that way. Time now for my first Global's Make Some Noise guest of the day. And it is to draw your attention first to a charity called Parenting Mental Health, which was founded by a woman, by a mother, Suzanne Alderson, who discovered, frankly, just how hard it can be to find any sort of support when you have a child, in her case a teenage daughter, in the vice-like grip of depression, anxiety, up to and including, in Suzanne's case, suicide attempts. And one of the things that always amazes me about Global's Make Some Noise is the way in which people who have been to hell and back want to help others in the same situation. You could understand, couldn't you, the temptation to want to slam the door upon those memories if you're lucky enough to come out the other side of them and never ever think about them again. But Parenting Mental Health, its very existence is contingent not just on Suzanne's desire to help other people going through similar nightmares from the ones she and her daughter endured, but also to sort of spread that experience through volunteers with experience in the same space. So there's no one better to talk to as a parent if your child is struggling with these sort of issues than a parent who has been through it, than someone who knows exactly what you are going through, because parents aren't trained or ready for the role. They have to manage as best they can. They have to make it up often as they go along. So Global's Make Some Noise is funding the Lived Experience Volunteer Skills and Empowerment Project at Parenting Mental Health for 2 years. And that will organise, train and empower volunteers, people with the experience of parenting a child with mental health needs, to help, and now we go into the lingo of the sector a bit, to help scale support. I'm joined by Lucy Law-Jones, who is a parent in precisely the position that I have described. And can we begin, Lucy, with the loneliness, with that sense of, you know, I think that you sort of presume there's a system there that should you need it, you just you press a button or you phone up and there will be a world of support. And then when you're actually in the position that we're describing here, you find out that there's often next to nothing. Absolutely. And not just for the young people. You've got that issue to deal with, that you're banging on every door, you're emailing, you're shouting, you're fighting, and actually for yourself as well. Absolutely. The key feelings that you end up with are, and I've experienced and experience still, are isolation, judgment by others, and a sense of hopelessness. That's one thing that Parenting Mental Health you hear time and time again is, you know, thank you for the hope. Thanks for sharing hope. Thanks for sharing, you know, that there's a way forward. People, if they've got
if they're lucky enough to have family around them, friends around them, a community around them, to offer them practical support or emotional support. Not everyone has that, or you have some of that, not
and
all
that
of
sometimes
it.
the best meaning relatives and friends can just not get it right through no fault of their own. They can end up making things worse.
Absolutely, and don't know what to say.
No.
So quite often, you'll get a text saying, "How are things?"
Yeah.
And you'll say, "Hard." And you don't get a reply.
Yeah.
And you think, "Oh, maybe I need to tell them a little bit more." So you tell them a tiny bit of what life's like, and you still don't get a reply. And sometimes
because they don't know what to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like they're being callous. Well, some might. I don't know your friends or your family, but generally speaking, it's it's a bit like grief. It's a bit like bereavement. You want to help, but you don't know what to say. You end up avoiding the person who's bereaved because you feel so uncomfortable and so self-conscious about being in the situation. And I know that your child was unable to go to school for 3 years. And that's judgment can kick in there. And language doesn't help because it's often called school refusal, as if it's a sort of, I don't fancy it today, Mum, as opposed to, I can't do this. And no one understands outside of that room when you're there how bad that is.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the fact that you've acknowledged that. It's one of my real bugbears and a trigger, the use of school refusal. It suggests that there's a choice by the young person. It ties in with, the use of the word truancy as well, that's being used more and more. There is, my son wouldn't choose to be like this and to feel like this. We wouldn't choose to allow him. So yes, sense of judgment is huge. So to find a group of people, a safe space where you can talk freely and openly and not feel judged is essential.
How did parenting mental health come into your life then? How did you make that contact?
Well, our son, he's 14 now, and he's struggled with mental health what seems like most of his life, and it manifests in all kinds of anxieties that affect our daily life 24/7, his life, our life. There's only the three of us at home. He's in a better place now.
Oh, good.
It climaxed in 2020, 2021, and it's been really, really hard. My husband and I both work full time. We've had to make job decisions and career decisions so that we can continue to support and advocate and fight for him constantly. How I found out about PMH was, I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of people, is Googling late at night, every day, emailing, searching for something to help. And there's not a lot out there at all. And I actually heard what came up on a Google search was the Partnering Not Parenting course that Suzanne Alderson has set up as part of the Parenting Mental Health. And I joined that course because it just aligned with how I was feeling about how I thought we needed to move forward. And again, like you said, there's no training in this. There's no handbook. There's no manual. It's parents desperately trying to work out what to do for the best. That led me to find out after the course, and part of the course I found out the website, joined the Facebook group. The Facebook group's just amazing. Read Suzanne's book about her own situation and her daughter's situation, Never Let Go, and found people just like me, found people just like my family. And that's why I ended up volunteering for PMH, because yes, I still need them.
Sure.
But I also wanted to give something back as well.
Paying it forward, aren't you, in a way? It's a beautiful thing, albeit that everyone would rather not be in the situation at all. If you are, this is a pretty hefty silver lining.
We say that all the time when we have new members. We say, we're so sorry you found us, but we're so glad.
One of the things I've taken from the work we do with Globals Make Some Noise, you just alluded to it there unintentionally, and I wonder how many of your husband and your colleagues would know about what was going on at home. So when I have to do the big thing at the dinner, Lucy, where I have to go on in the middle of a pop concert, everyone's having a wonderful time, I have to go onto the stage and shake the tin to... Yeah. And it always strikes me that at every table in that room, there will be at least one person who is going through something that we're trying to help with, but whose dinner companions and colleagues probably don't know. And if they do know, they won't know the half of it, because it's like a language that only the people who've been through it can speak. Absolutely. And that's why the sense of solidarity and almost homecoming is so profound with charities like PMH.
Absolutely. And you find yourself being my husband and I have both had people from different parts of our lives, work life, extended friends that have stuck by us because, my son's lost all his friends that he grew up with since the age of 3. And we've lost a lot of friend connections. But we've had people get in touch with us and say, oh, there's this person who's said some things that sound a bit like your story. Do you mind if we put them in touch with you? And so PMH is that on a much bigger scale. It is solidarity, as you say. It's the lived experience. And fundamentally, we get it.
That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one of the things you get is I don't know quite what words to use, but in the way that for you and your husband, your mental health and your mood and your happiness is contingent almost entirely upon how your boy is doing. So if he has a good day, you're on cloud 9.
Yeah.
And then it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and you're suddenly back in the doldrums again. And that's the loneliest place to be.
It's absolutely like that. I mean, this morning on the way here, I got a text from my husband to say he's gone into school, okay, and he wasn't sick this morning because one of his anxieties is that he is sick every morning. And so for me, that's okay. I can have a good day. Yeah. It's not going to be playing on my mind.
No one gets that unless they've been through it, I don't think.
And I used to, it's a little bit easier now. Things are slightly better for us. But I hear this analogy time and time again. It's like you're behind a Perspex wall and it's like a one-way Perspex wall. You don't feel seen, you don't feel heard. You actually feel quite forgotten. These sort of, tendrils of understanding coming out from groups like Parenting Mental Health are absolutely, a lifeline.
What a perfect word. Mm-hmm. Tendrils. Yeah. It just comes to you now.
Yes.
We should be on the other side of this microphone. That was fantastic. I'm going to use that because you can build a tendril. You can buy a tendril right now by texting LBC40, LBC30 or LBC20 to donate £40, £30 or £20. No spaces, so LBC40, LBC30, LBC20, and you text it to 70766 and that will automatically start going to work towards building tendrils, not just at PMH, but at all the small charities that Global's Make Some Noise supports. You must be 16 and over. Seek the bill payer's permission, please. Standard network charges apply. You can donate much more than that or less than that. Every penny counts at makesomenoise.com, where you will also find the full terms and conditions. But that is the difference that it can make. Tendrils. What a wonderful word. Thank you, Lucy.
Sure, you can have that
well, I will. I shall be repeating that word separately over the course of the rest of the day. And love to the family as well, seriously.
Thank you.
It is 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A lot of messages coming in response to that conversation with Lucy and the work that Parenting Mental Health does. I shall share some of them with you shortly because I don't know if you need a little bit of help understanding the importance of charities like that, the power and the beauty that they can bring into people's lives. Desperately needed support and help is a beautiful thing. So I'll share those with you later. But I'm going to do something different. So, I do it a bit tongue-in-cheek sometimes. I know you know all my tricks by now. I can't get anything past you. But I have so far failed to make you very excited. I suppose I could end there, couldn't I? I have so far failed to make you very excited about the Conservative leadership battle. And I never give up. You know that. And part of me is tempted to do a phone-in about why you're not excited about the Conservative leadership battle. But I think that will be an inevitable side order for whatever we decide to serve up as a main course. I mean, why people aren't excited, actually, particularly Conservative supporters, Conservative voters, actually is going to be the same answer in some cases to the answer to the question that I am going to ask you. So what you have now, and there's one Conservative MP quoted in one newspaper today who describes it as a choice of an ECHR one-trick pony who believes our special forces murder people and an anti-woke one-trick pony who picks endless fights. As a choice, it's, and they use a word, this is a Tory backbencher speaking to Peter Walker of The Guardian, as a choice it's, and they use a word I can't really say on the radio without incurring the wrath of Ofcom. Another tells the political correspondent at the I newspaper, I don't think either of them will lead the party into the next election, which is a position that I have heard from all sorts of corners, all sorts of places. I want you to tell me what I'd like to do in the first instance is confine the conversation to people who have voted Conservative in the past, ideally quite often, maybe not every single iteration of the Conservative Party. It would have been tricky, I think, this time round, this year. But I don't want the conversation to be a post-mortem conducted by enemies of the corpse, as it were. And, there I am falling into my own trap by describing it as a corpse. I often do these names. They come off quite trippingly, don't they? They come off the tongue quite trippingly when you think of the Dominic Reeves and the David Gawkes and the Rory Stewarts and the Anna Soubrys, and then the sort of elder statesmen of that generation of Tories where you've got your Ken Clarks and your Nicholas Soameses, and you've got people who must be absolutely repulsed by both of the final contenders for the Conservative Party leadership. A party that put Theresa May in the box seat just 8 years ago now has a choice between, as that Conservative backbencher puts it, a one-trick pony banging on about Winston Churchill's, his desperation to abandon one of Winston Churchill's proudest legacies, the European Convention on Human Rights, and another one who is one of those people who's passionately anti-woke without ever really being able to tell you what it is that woke means. It is a ridiculous choice. But the problem is that I am obviously a fairly well-seasoned critic of the post-Brexit iteration of the Tory party. In fact, I'm a fairly well-seasoned critic of post-2010 conservatism in general. Prior to 2010, I wasn't even that political. I started doing this job. I wasn't actually a particularly political animal, but it was only two things politicised me, possibly even radicalised me. One was speaking to people on an almost daily basis who were absolutely certain of things that weren't true. And that's why I've got such a bee in my bonnet about the media in this country. It might have been very good for my career to have come across caller after caller after caller, absolutely convinced of things that were simply not true. And it was really easy to prove that they weren't true, which is what created the viral clip back in the day. But then the second thing was the fundamental unfairness of so much of our society and the struggle that many people face that goes utterly unrecognised and even is routinely denied by people on the right of British politics, whether they're in the media, whether they're in Parliament, or whether they're just in public. Those two things kind of radicalised me, or certainly politicised me, to the point where now I like nothing more than getting stuck into a good political conversation, as you know. But I don't know how interesting it is for me to talk about the choice between honest Bob Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch as like the choice between a rock and a hard place, because certainly since 2016 and most definitely since 2019, I think that the current iteration of the Conservative Party has been a matter of national shame. I mean, truly, truly disgraceful conduct by individuals and indeed by the entire institution. A disgusting shower of individual. Well, I said I'd stop, because how helpful is that to anybody? People who are enthusiastic about either Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick or both of them, people who can't believe this embarrassment of riches, this magnificent choice between the Garden of Eden and Shangri-La. I can't believe how lucky. I don't believe you exist. But if you do, I want you to ring me on 0345 60 60973. But I can't quite imagine. Well, I suppose we live in a country where some people think that Nigel Farage is an honest broker. So maybe people are looking at honest Bob Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch and thinking, yes, this is the future we dream of. This is the future we deserve. I guess it's unlikely that you will be listening to me on a regular basis if you slip into that category, because of course I've got that terrible habit of holding up mirrors and then you hate what you see in it. But if you are what I would loosely describe as a traditional conservative, and there is some increasing talk of the Conservative Party splitting along these lines when either Jenrick or Badenoch gets into position, if they do, as seems likely, tack further to the right in pursuit of the reform unicorns instead of trying to claw back territory lost to the Liberal Democrats, then it's going to leave what are called one nation conservatives in quite a pretty pickle. They are going to be ostensibly on a team that is captained by someone they find politically, if not personally, repellent. So you are looking at the possibility of a split in the actual Conservative Party. So that leads us to, I think, two questions, doesn't it? I mean, the first is, as someone who is a traditional Conservative voter, it doesn't mean every single time. It doesn't mean you'd vote for the Conservative candidate, even if it was a marrow, a marrow with a Tory rosette on it. I don't mean that necessarily, but if you are that, you probably don't like that description of yourself. But if you can't conceive of ever voting for anybody else ever, you're more than welcome to ring in. But the idea that you are, kind of homeless, the politically homeless, have been a constituency that's fascinated. A lot of Labour supporters were politically homeless between 2016 and 2019, or certainly felt that they were. I've got two questions. The first is pretty obvious. What do you make of where your party is now? What do you make of this choice between Honest Bob Jenrick, the mural destroyer, and Kemi Badenoch, the maternity pay critic? What is it that you feel when you survey this choice? Okay, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And then the second question is, and I really hope you get stuck into this, it's Friday. They often can take a slightly more leisurely approach to some issues on a Friday. I do know why. We've all got sort of crackerjack running through our veins, haven't we, or crunchies. What do you actually think is going to happen? I'm probably more interested in your thoughts and theories on this than I am in the thoughts and theories of the people that get paid to pontificate by the right-wing media, because they're so bent. They're so corrupt. None of them held to account for being wrong about everything from austerity to Liz Truss. They'll just turn up and file their 2,000-word pieces for the big papers or their 500-word pieces for the tabloids and go away utterly untouched by the consequences of what they've wished upon the country. It's the Truss one, more than Brexit and austerity, and even Boris Johnson. It's the way they greeted the Truss budget that I find extraordinary. In any other line of work, if you had written the praise that the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph published for Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget, you'd be out of a job. You'd have been out of the job that night. The minute the gilt markets responded in the way that everybody sensible knew that they would respond, you'd have been fired. You'd have been fired on the spot. It'd be like me coming to work on Monday and effing and blinding my way all the way to the 10:15 break. And I wouldn't come back after 10:15. I would have so roundly soiled my professional reputation that the management would have been carting me out of the building without my feet touching the ground. It'd be coming on air and telling you, I don't know, just sort of blatant, dangerous libels or something like that, but they can do it. You're writing for the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph. You can talk about how it's the best budget of your life. Well, finally a true Tory budget, and of course there are no consequences because they're not really in the business of what we would consider to be journalism. They're propagandists for inherited wealth, or propagandists for wealth. It's not always inherited, of course. So I'm more interested in your theories. There was quite an interesting piece in one of those papers today, which was resurrecting the possibility of a Boris Johnson return. But that just gives you a parameter of how wide the goal is when I say to you, what do you think is going to happen next? 11:15 is the time. So you are a traditional Tory, or you are a Tory voter, a possible Tory voter, a past Tory voter. What do you think about the choice between Jenrick and Badenoch? 0345 6060 973. But then, bearing in mind, let's just give you two things. The possibility that it won't be either of them that actually leads the Tories into the next election, something that a lot of Tory backbenchers privately concede or consider to be the case. And also the piece in the Telegraph today about the likelihood of Boris Johnson sliding his way back into contention in the not too distant future. So there's two things there that you could file under fantastical or but certainly theoretical, but I think they're both perfectly plausible. What do you think happens next to the Tory party? Because if James Cleverly had been in the final two, it would be an almost impossible question to ask, given that there would be so much contingent on who wins. But whichever way it goes, a weirdo's going to win. The Conservative Party is going to be led by a kind of not very pleasant weird person. However it plays out, you are, as ever, welcome to challenge that analysis as well. But I also want to hear about Liberal Democrat voters. So I've got the Conservative question for you, which is pretty straightforward. What do you think of the choice? What do you think happens next? Hit those numbers now, you will get through. But people who voted Liberal Democrat in the last election, I kind of think you might be the kingmakers in a way. If you're not a traditional Tory, but you voted tactically, that the idea that the Tories aren't going to, under Badenoch or Jenrick, they're not coming after you. If you were going to go Labour, you'd have gone Labour in 2024. And so far, I suspect you've not seen much from Keir Starmer that makes you think you made a choice when you went Lib Dem. Or you did it tactically because you knew that getting the Tories out was your priority over getting anybody in. So I just want to know whether or not you think the Liberal Democrats, this is part of the question of what happens next. Could we be sitting here in 3 or 4 years' time contemplating the possibility of the Liberal Democrats becoming the traditional opposition to a Labour government, the main opposition to a Labour government? There's so much on the table, it feels to me, as if there's so much to play for. There's so many unknown knowns and known unknowns that I just want to have a kind of traditional political phone-in, but with a slight skew towards Conservative supporters. I think you're more interesting on this issue than the rest of us are. Not least because we're suffering from an almost fatal case of Schadenfreude. 0345 6060973. What do you think of the choice? And what do you think is on the road ahead? Not just for the Tory party, but for the whole of UK politics. The Tory party splits. Liberal Democrats become the de facto opposition party. So much is in the lap of the gods that I'm fascinated to know what you think about what might happen next. And if you hit those numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're kind of wondering what you think about the state of the Tory party as a Tory supporter. Okay, that's question number one. And then question number two is, what do you think is going to happen next in UK politics, given that the Tory party is now certain to be led by a particularly divisive person? And James Cleverly, for his myriad faults, is not a spectacularly divisive person. Okay, phone lines are open. Alfie's in Birmingham. Alfie, what would you like to say?
James, good morning. I just can't believe what the Conservatives are doing. I think they've lost... have they lost the will to live? Are they on a self-destruct cycle?
You are, just to be clear, you would describe yourself traditionally as a Tory supporter, a Tory voter.
That's correct. Yeah,
yes.
That's correct. Yes. Originally from Northern Ireland, where the political scene is slightly different.
You can say that again.
Mainland, yeah, certainly. But mainland UK for the last 30 years, and traditionally a Conservative voter. But in the last 12 months, I think they've gone mad. You can say what you like about
only in the last 12 months. I'm conscious of my own biases in this space. Although I'd argue they were evidence based. It's not. I mean, so losing it to Keir Starmer, a historic defeat, albeit that it's a wide but shallow majority, a loveless landslide it's been described as. You would have expected a very different response from the defeated party.
Sure, absolutely. To sort of clarify the last 12 months, 12, 18 months, Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, all of the scandals around Boris, going back even further. But, this was a real opportunity, I guess, for them to rebuild. What they have, I believe, done in a single swooping, you talk about James Cleverly being a non-divisive candidate. Yeah. He, in my opinion, a much better choice out of the three.
Yes. What's extraordinary, and fits with your analysis, he stood in front of conference, not far from where you are today, from where you're calling. He stood in front of conference and said, we've got to be less weird. And the Parliamentary Conservative Party has responded by saying, "Oh no, we don't."
well, you look at the dangers of the future. Your second question, I think, is an absolutely prudent question. What happens next? This could be a pivotal moment, not just about the handing potentially the opposition to maybe the Liberal Democrats, but God forbid, Reform UK. They're gathering momentum. Yes, Boris has raised his head again in the last few days in the media.
He says he can sort of neuter that threat, as it were, electorally. He thinks that had he been leader at the last election, he would have been able to neuter that threat. I mean, I don't know, but that's the mad thing, really. That's the bit where I think all of the analysis would probably agree, is that there is a choice to be made between whether they try and sort of go after the nativist unicorns of the Reform Party, or whether they try to go back, certainly in terms of seats, whether they try to claw back some of the space lost to the Liberal Democrats. And I can't see either of the current contenders taking the second option. So where do you think the Tory party goes then? How likely do you think a genuine schism is, a genuine split? Oh, the technology failed us once again. There we are. Alfie, I'll just double check. Yes. So I've got plenty of calls, but I'm not sure that I will be able to hear any of them. There's a little philosophical conundrum for you. If someone is on the line speaking to me, but I can't hear them, is he actually on the line at all? I don't know. It's like the tree falling in the forest. Could we try again with Alfie, shall we? Can you hear me, Alfie? No. Okay. So the story that looks at the possibility of a split is quite detailed, actually. Moderate Tories reeling from the shock election of James Cleverly. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you want to win an election, don't put Grant Shapps in charge of your campaign. The idea of having to choose between two MPs who are clearly on the right of a very right-wing party. So the Tory party, since the cull in 2019, is probably more right-wing than it's ever been. And they've now got a choice between two leaders who are on the right of the right wing in their own party. So the idea that should the next leader choose to go after further right votes, to go after Nigel Farage's crew, then the Tory Reform Group, which represents many One Nation Conservatives, could actually have an existential dilemma to confront. They've actually said, they've put out a statement saying, this is the Tory Reform Group, that it cannot endorse either Badenoch or Jenrick for the leadership. So that's a significant swathe of the centre of the party that can't get behind either leader, even before the decision has been taken. Simon is in Milton Keynes. Whether or not I can hear him, we're about to discover.
Can you hear me, James?
There, I like that pause. That was just for my blood pressure, that pause, wasn't it?
Pregnant pause.
Well, yes, it was very pregnant. What's going on? What made you pick up the phone?
Well, I before you ended your diatribe, and I hope you don't rip me apart, I was just saying to your producer that I'm a Labour voter. Yeah. I'm not a Labour supporter.
Okay.
I've always wanted to be a Liberal voter. I'm a PR man, really. Yes. That's what I'd like.
Fair enough.
I play golf a lot, and my golf partner is, until recently, a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party.
Yes.
He's relinquished that a year or two ago.
Can I ask why? Do we know why? You can get a lot of talking done on a golf course, can't you? But so do we know why? What was the straw that broke that particular camel's back?
Well, I think he might have blonde, scruffy hair, but
okay.
Or she may have had blonde hair.
Yes.
But we don't talk politics because we're very different politics. But the fact that we are very different politics, I can see a future at the next election where we both vote for the Liberals.
Wow. Because
of what's happened, that's where we are. I mean, we're miles apart. We're the same people, but he's a very, very blue kind of free market Conservative. I'm a woolly Liberal. I'd vote Green probably even under PR. But I could see a future where we both vote for Ed Davey, his party. If these two...
It's extraordinary how much of that... I mean, I think political journalism is going through a bit of a crisis at the moment because it's obsessing about things like Taylor Swift concerts and Farage's crew, whereas in fact historians would probably be where you are. They'd probably be looking at the Liberal Democrats and thinking, I wonder if they're on the brink of a seismic change. I know they've already secured one of their best results in Parliament, and if the Tories continue to run away from that ground, the ground that the Liberal Democrats inhabit, then you would arrive at the ground from the left, and your golfing partner would arrive at the same ground from the right. That's what you're saying.
Totally. I mean, I spend most of my time, when I'm not listening to you, arguing with people on TikTok about reform.
Right.
And this morning already, they're saying all these people, if the reform Conservative people change party or, whatever,
yes,
they should be a by-election. But if it's a by-election and they're more moderate, you would have thought that by-election would be more liberal than...
Let's go. Well, the
right
by-elections are going to be interesting. And, of course, some of them will be winnable for the Tories, which is why one commentator today suggested there might be a way back for Boris Johnson. Your friend would be an example of the possible split in the Tory party. If you don't want to go down the sort of nativist fantasy politics that Nigel Farage offers, and you are right-wing sort of fiscally, then you could... He wouldn't even be holding his nose to vote for the Liberal Democrats.
No, not at all. I think he wouldn't vote for what we've just had, but if we got the Dominic Reeves back or the Rory Stewart's back and someone like that a bit more sensible, even Jeremy Hunt, he'd probably say, well, if they can split and make, then I'd go with them again.
It is extraordinary. I mean, sometimes you think that a broad coalition is a good thing. As a fan of proportional representation, you would be obviously open to big coalitions, big European-style coalitions, where several parties end up combining forces in order to achieve a parliamentary majority and therefore govern together. But the idea of the Conservative Party now being such a broad and unhappy coalition that it can accommodate Jeremy Hunt, for example, although he has been a little bit chameleon-like in recent years, and, honest Bob Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch. I wonder whether... What's that line? It's in that poem, isn't it? It's W.B. Yeats, the centre cannot hold. The centre cannot hold if you've got these two tensions pulling in opposite directions. Thank you, Simon. Who usually wins the golf, you or the Tory?
Recently, me.
There you go.
But well, I say that. I think he's won more money off of me. But I've got this year we've made a fiscal kind of arrangement, but my golf game has improved more than his. So,
there you go. There's a lesson for us all there. I don't know what it is. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:34. I've just noticed that John Crace in The Guardian also calls Jenrick Honest Bob. I hope I got there first. I hope I'm not eating John's stealing his lunch there. He's got a new book out at the moment, actually, that I heartily recommend. But it is the Conservatives to whom we are turning our attention this morning. He goes for Kamikaze, get it? Kamikaze, that's quite good, actually. And Honest Bob. And that is your choice. What does that say to you as a traditional Conservative voter? And the road ahead is fascinating. I think that if we had... I don't know quite what the word is when I talk about political journalism being in crisis. It's largely because so many of the norms have been broken by the last few years, whether it's the sort of intellectual arguments about the dangers of false equivalence and false balance that most obviously are displayed at the BBC, or whether it is the fact that so many people in my profession ended up being cheerleaders for blatant liars, like most obviously Boris Johnson, of course. It breaks something fundamental, that notion of simple rules that nobody breaks, even if you disagree furiously about points of principle or policy. There are things that you don't do. And of course, Johnson and obviously on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump did them all the time. And that's broken something. Journalism doesn't know how to cope with that, still trying to work it out and, in my view, failing. But the question of what is on the road ahead is fascinating and probably contains the Liberal Democrats at a level that most analysis currently either ignores or underestimates. A couple of phone lines free. Grab one if you want. Dan is in Leeds. He already has. Dan, what would you like to say?
All right, James. How are you doing? It's great to get through to you.
Likewise, mate. What's on your mind?
Well, I'm one of the mouth-breathing knuckle-draggers that you like to put into Idiot's Corner quite frequently. So my opinion is probably more pertinent in terms of me being a reform...
Why do you describe yourself like that? Why do you describe yourself like? What are the views you hold that I think that would?
I don't. That's how you would describe me.
Yeah. So what are the views you hold that make you think I would describe you like that?
I'm a reform and conservative switcher. I would be torn between Badenoch and Farage.
Yes, but what are the views you hold that you think I would take issue with?
I think that we have a problem with immigration. I think we have problems with identity and culture in this country. I think we have an erosion of British values. I think we've lost our sense of identity.
So you know what happens now. So I ask you what values you think are being eroded. I think that's a line problem rather than Dan necessarily electing not to answer the question. But it's a fairly straightforward question. Dan, are you there? No, we'll try and resurrect that phone line in a minute. Why don't I take a moment to give you some of the responses to the conversation that I had earlier with Lucy about parenting mental health, which is the focus of my fundraising efforts today for Make Some Noise, the LBC charity that works with small local projects across the UK. This was an extraordinary response to just a relatively short conversation. Amy writes, I am living through this now. Lisa writes, I'm a member of the Facebook page and thank goodness for it because this life is so lonely. Jenny says, thank you for pointing me to this charity. I can't tell you how much I need this. Alex says, I'm a member of the Parenting Mental Health Facebook group and it is a really amazing place in which I have found support and solace. It's also taught me that I wasn't alone and that others are there to help and who know what I am feeling and what the impact of our situation is like. Thank them for everything they do on my behalf. And that's not even half of the contributions that came in as while that conversation was being conducted. Should we have another crack at Dan in Leeds? Dan, are you there?
I'm still here,
Fantastic.
James. I'm waiting in the sunshine.
So you could hear me then, but I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, well, LBC has technical problems all the time, doesn't it?
Well, not really, but we've had a bad couple of days. Anyway, the British values that are being eroded. Let's go through them one by one.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think for me the biggest thing is I think we have imported a lot of people that don't have the same values when it comes to the treatment of women.
Yeah, but we're talking about what the values are. What are the British values that are being eroded?
Well, we would treat women equally.
So you've got the same value that you always had. So your value hasn't been eroded. There are just some people who disagree with you.
I think we import cultures that treat women badly.
Well,
we're now the acid-throwing capital of the world. Acid crime is, through the roof.
Okay.
How did Britain become the acid-chucking capital of the world?
Well, I don't know that that's true.
Well, we certainly are in
But it
Europe.
doesn't involve an erosion of British values because you and I still believe what we believed before the people you're talking about
It's an erosion of women's faces, usually.
Okay, well, you don't exactly sound sympathetic when you start
I am sympathetic.
talking
I think
like
it's terrible.
But
I think it's terrible.
So what is the British value that you feel is being eroded? Because any value is going to have people that don't hold it. The idea that my life or your life is being diminished or eroded, how does that work? Why are you less committed now to women's rights than you were when immigration was lower?
My commitment to
so nothing's been eroded then?
Not because I'm not an immigrant that holds different views about women.
But there'll be plenty of people who aren't immigrants who hold different views about women. I think one of the Reform MPs was jailed for beating one up, wasn't he?
Yeah, just like there are.
So is that an erosion of British values?
Yes, I think it is.
But you support that party?
Example of a more domestic.
But I think Reform is the only party that has an MP who's been jailed for beating up a woman, and the British value you've gone for is respect for women, and yet you're here to tell me that you support the only party that has an MP who's been incarcerated for beating up a woman. How did that happen?
What do you mean, how did it happen?
Well, how did you end up on the radio trumpeting support for a party that has an MP who's been incarcerated for beating up a woman and claiming that they represent your desire to see more respect for women? How did that happen?
If you remember what I said I was torn between Badenoch and Farage. Yes. I'm on the fence between them. So I'm not exactly...
Now you've remembered that one of Farage's colleagues was banged up for beating up a woman and you care so much about... And you care so much of women's rights, then the choice is easy, isn't it? It's Badenoch all day long.
Well, there's lots of bad individual apples within all the parties.
So, I can't think of anybody in the Labour Party that's been jailed for beating up a woman, or the Conservative Party, or the Liberal Democrats. But let's talk about maternity pay then. How does Badenoch's attitude to maternity play into your passionate desire to see more respect for women?
Shall I tell you what I like about Kemi?
Yeah, go on then.
I'll tell you what I like, because you keep hitting her with the maternity thing, and I think that was a slip-up, and I don't think she'd ever enact a policy like that.
Wasn't a slip-up, mate. She doesn't do slip-ups. She said so.
Well, yeah, I think that's rubbish. But
hang on, you're supposed to be bigging her up.
Well, I'll tell you why I like her. I think she's a rare specimen in politics because she's an engineer in her background. She's from an immigrant background where she's come here and done a lot as an individual in sort of getting on her own 2 feet.
I think she was born here.
And yes, but her family came over with relatively little,
right?
And she's built up from that. And she's an engineer, which is rare in politics. She's a problem solver.
I think the biographical details are actually a bit wrong there. I think she came here when she was born here, and then she came on her own when she was 16. I don't know that her family have ever settled here.
I'm not sure on a family detail, but I know that she's.
But that was your main. That was what you just said as the reason why you like her so much, and it's not true.
Well, I like the fact that she's a problem solver because
what problems has she solved?
Well, I'm speaking fundamentally in terms of her inclinations.
So am I. What problems has she solved fundamentally?
Well, she's not been put in power to do it. I mean, she was in the trades. I think she did a lot of trades work that was quite good.
For example?
I think she's all of the trade deals that she's put forward.
She hasn't put any trade deals forward at all.
She worked in the Department of Trade and she was involved in a lot of the negotiations.
I worked in River Island, mate, but I'm not a fashion designer. Tell me a trade deal that she put together, an actual trade deal.
She was involved in the CPTPP, whatever it is.
The what?
I won't vote. CPTPP, whatever it's called.
CPTPP? What?
Yeah, there's too many P's in that one, isn't there?
Right. Well, I don't know, mate. You're the one using it as an example of what a clever politician she is. So trade deals that she negotiated or signed.
There's lots and lots
Liz
of
Truss took the credit for that. Liz Truss took the credit for that one.
There was lots that she was involved in.
Go on. Well, then it'll be really easy to give me an example then, Dan.
Well, just because I personally don't have the memory to name every specific
but you
instance.
Personally just said live on the radio that was proof of what a good egg she is, and so you must have proof of your proof, as it were.
Well, I told you that I think that she's a problem solver.
And I said, what problems has she solved?
Well,
and you said...
I'm contrasting that more, James, from a kind of... Most politicians, they studied politics, they studied law, they're lawyers, they're philosophers. They don't do anything that involves actual hands-on problem-solving.
Which is why it's going to be so easy for you to give me an example of the hands-on problem-solving that she's done.
Well, she worked in IT originally, didn't she? So she's been an IT
You're the
engineer.
expert. She worked at The Spectator for a while, and you've got a problem with journalists.
Well, I'm not saying I have a problem with journalists. I just think that politicians need.
So let's not get distracted. Let's go back to the problems that she solved and the trade deals that she signed.
Well, if you're interested in the discussion of where I think she'll take politics.
No, I'm interested in your reasons for admiring her, which are her problem-solving abilities and the trade deals that she signed. So I'm going to have to ask for some examples.
I can't. If I'm honest with you, I can't list every trade negotiation.
No, I don't need all of them. I just need one.
I think she was involved in the CPTPP.
You can't even say it. You can hardly cite that as an example of her negotiating acumen, and that was long before she got into the Department of Trade.
Has she not been involved in some of the India-UK FTA?
We haven't got one. We haven't got a trade deal.
No, but there's been lots of waves of negotiations.
No, but you were telling me about the ones that she had actually concluded and negotiated. But
she's not in that position right now.
But when she was.
Wait, but she was involved in those negotiations, and the Labour government has continued on with that negotiation.
You can't tell me that she achieved something and then tell me that she didn't. But let's look at the problems that she solved. Let's do the problems that she solved.
I also like the fact, James, that she's going back to the fundamentals. She's going back to the emotional bedrock of conservatism,
yes.
the instinct to protect what people have. She's going back to those fundamentals, and it's an emotional thing. It's about identity. It's about culture.
What have you lost then? What has happened to your identity recently that needs protecting by Kemi Badenoch?
I think. Well, we've had record immigration. We've got 1% of an increase in immigration. It's highest than it's been post-war, isn't it?
It's about to come down by about half.
And look at the riots. Look at
but
the
this isn't your right. Well, the
have.
riots were undertaken by. We could probably speculate upon the political affiliations of the kind of people that were rioting because they share your views on immigration. But the idea of your identity that needs protecting by Kemi Badenoch, what have you lost?
Well, like I said, we've become the acid-throwing.
No, I know you don't
capital
like
of
foreigners,
Europe.
but what have you lost? Your identity?
It's not foreigners.
No,
I think if you want
some
to
of them.
put the finger on the issue exactly.
Let's not get distracted. I mean, the question is your identity. What have you lost?
My personal identity is separate from the country's identity. I'm talking about the country's identity and the country's values.
No, talking about an emotional sense of... No, it's not. Of course it's not. It's an emotional sense of identity that you're describing to me. And I want to know what it is that I'm not feeling. I need protecting from.
The collective consciousness of the country.
Are you?
I'm not talking
That's
about
very
individuals.
bold, isn't it? How can you talk about the collective consciousness of the country?
What else are British values if they're not a collective consciousness?
I didn't use the phrase. You used the
values.
phrase. You can't tell me what a British value is.
Yes, but I talk about British values.
Well, name one. Name a British value.
You talk about my
Tell me a British
values.
value. Tell me a British value.
Free speech.
There we go. That's there. That's safe.
I don't think it particularly is. Look,
what aren't you allowed to
riots.
say? What aren't you allowed to say now?
You can't say the wrong thing on social media without being locked up after a riot.
Okay, who's been locked up for?
And be let out of prison early.
Dan, no one has been locked up for saying the wrong thing on social media. The people who've been locked up for their behaviour on social media are the people who were inciting violence or encouraging people to set fire to hotels.
There are some people that merely said racist things.
That's not true.
They didn't incite
Okay,
violence.
you know what I'm going to do now?
There was also somebody...
No, don't change this up. You know what I'm going to do now?
Listen.
No, I am listening. That's the problem. I don't think you're used to it. Give me the example of the person who was jailed for saying something racist.
I can't remember the guy's name off
But
the top of my head.
every single thing you've offered up to me as proof of the point that you think that you're making, I just do this really simple, polite little thing, Dan, and I say, oh, would you mind providing me with the example or with the evidence? And what do you do?
Well, I should have written them all down and put them on a list in front of me.
No, you should know them.
Every name and detail.
No. It's not every name and detail, Dan. It's one example. It's one example of a trade deal that Kemi Badenoch concluded. It's one example of a problem that Kemi Badenoch has solved. It's one example of somebody... She didn't do it. It's one example of somebody being sent to jail for saying something racist on social media. So I've got to go to the break now. But before I do that... When you came on and said that you were the kind of candidate for Idiot's Corner, did you realise it was because you were someone who holds really strong opinions without having any evidence to back them up?
I can back them up when I've got the time to put it together. I don't have time on a line.
But just to be clear, you rang me, right? We didn't phone you up and sort of ambush you.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:52 is the time, and with no further ado, I redirect your attention to Global's Make Some Noise. That is our LBC's charity, and we're in the business this morning of raising money for them and therefore for the charities, the smaller, often quite local charities that Global's Make Some Noise supports. I can't tell you how important the work that they do is, as in I can try, but I will never fully convey to you the scale of the task before some of these charities and the importance of the role that they play in people's lives. Nikki Neal is the CEO of the charity we were talking about earlier, Parenting Mental Health. And Nikki, I don't know how much you heard, but the messages that came in while I was talking to Lucy earlier were extraordinary, actually. This is us. Wrote Tom, I will be donating and finding out more. I'm living this at the moment. Emma writes, as a parent who is drowning at the moment with the needs of a son, thank you. This has given me a moment of solidarity with someone and made me feel not so alone. Tracy writes, thank you for the interview about parenting mental health. I could totally resonate and wish that they'd been around 14 years ago before my son lost his fight. I mean, that is the stakes, isn't it? God knows we feel nothing but sympathy for Tracy, but that's what's at stake sometimes with the children that you help. How did you get involved?
Well, I got involved because I originally knew Suzanne Alderson, our founder, and was working with her at the time. Her daughter's mental health went downhill. So I got involved with the charity very early on. I became a trustee of the charity when it was nothing and we had nowhere to go. We had no money. We didn't really know what to do to help, but we knew we wanted to do something. And then 2 years ago, I became temporary CEO. I'm still temporary CEO 2 years in, but there's a lot of work for us to do. And, you know, I was completely moved all the time through it because I've been through issues with mental health myself. I lost my father to poor mental health. So it's something that I understand deeply and have done all my life.
What would happen if PMH didn't exist? What I mean, either on a macro level or on individual familial levels?
I think the impacts are really significant. We've just done a report to really try and understand how much this is touching families and what the impact is that poor mental health is having. And what we've really started to understand is the ripple effect that happens once a child has poor mental health. So the knock on to the family is really significant. We've got parents who can't sleep, who are getting sick themselves, who are putting on weight, drinking too much, you know, having the situation completely exacerbated for them and for siblings of young people going through it as well. It affects things like your work life and your finances. We've often got parents who have to leave jobs or go on 0 hours contracts. So it has huge impact financially. And then, you know, the intrinsic level, and you've just said it there, the feelings of being alone are so significant and overwhelming.
What does success look like? Just give me an idea. Give me an example of one of the lives that you've touched and what you can actually see in front of you with your own eyes of the work that...
I think what we do is we touch people in really micro ways. So it's not something that you'd go, oh, yeah, that's a thing that I desperately need or want. But it's that sense of community and that feeling of being in a village. When you can't talk to your own parents or your own siblings or your friends and family about what you're going through, it takes everything away from you. And often that affects relationships as well. So husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, and you can't talk to the people closest to you. So the biggest impact for us is just being able to go, we've got you, we understand you, we're with it, we're in it with you.
And what is the money that people listening to this are, if they haven't already, are about to start sending in its thousands? What will that money achieve? Where will it go?
So one of the things that, you know, online can be a really challenging place, and that's actually where we hold most of our parents. So we've got 45,000 parents in an online community. So to manage 45,000 individual families and what they're going through takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. So we couldn't possibly hope to employ all the people that would support those people. So how we do it is through volunteering. And that's where Global's Make Some Noise has really helped us, because we've been able to train our volunteers. We've been able to support our volunteers to keep our communities really safe. So we are constantly looking out for new support from volunteers and people who have been there and can bring their lived experience to bear, because as Lucy said before, you know, nothing can replace actually that sense of I've been through this and I can hold your hand through it. So volunteers are absolutely core to us, but they need things like laptops and training and phones and all of the things that keep us alive and online. So that's really where a lot of money goes. It takes us £28 an hour to run our community, because it's on 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
And it needs to be, because some people look, it's going to be 3 o'clock in the morning where you
exactly. And it usually is, to be honest. Yes. And because we're global, you know, if you're up in the UK at 3 o'clock in the morning, chances are a parent in Australia is going to answer you and come back to you. So that makes it a really nice symbiotic kind of relationship. Yes. But you also realise the scale of the problem and how significant that is.
You've read my mind, because I'm 45,000 parents.
And that's just in our community.
Well, they're the ones that have found you.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, God knows how many people, and my inbox again is going bonkers under the weight of people telling me that they are feeling seen for the first time ever, because they have not found anything like PMA.
I think that's what we do, you know, when it's 20% of young people have a diagnosable mental health condition now. And when we talk about young people, we're talking up to, at least the age of 25. But we're not just about, young people in our community. If your child is 45 and you're still caring for them, you're as welcome in PMH as if your child's 7. So if you're a parent, you're welcome in our community.
Gosh. What about the idea that this shouldn't be necessary? This should be something that's taken up by society or by the state, that organisations like PMH are wonderful, but in a sense papering over systemic cracks that run through our entire country.
I think that's true, but I think we could waste a lot of energy on trying to fix those absolute systemic issues. Waiting lists at the moment in the UK are probably around 2 years for you to originally see any kind of support from the NHS at the moment. So when you've got a 2-year wait with a desperately ill child, you need some support and you need some care. So grassroots charities really do make a difference, and I think it's really important that they get the support that they need, because they understand the problems in a way that the system really can't understand those problems.
Yes, I mean, another one here, just listening to your guest resonates with everything that I'm going through and have been through with my child. You brought tears to my eyes, and a lot of people who have only heard of it for the first time today. So, all the more reason to donate, because your business is probably likely to pick up a little bit in the course of this afternoon.
I suspect so. I mean, that brings its own challenges, because, with more members, actually, we need more support. And, when I'm sat in the CEO role, I have to make choices, really difficult choices, between what projects we're going to run, what projects we can't run, who we can support and who we can't.
Of course.
And,
Well, that's why it's such a beautiful model, actually, because there's that side of it, but then there's the self-generating side of it as well.
Absolutely.
The online community, it looks after itself almost.
It absolutely
as long
does.
as the resources are there to keep it ticking along.
And you need rules and you need volunteers. Volunteers are the absolute key to all of this. And, lived experience is one thing, but dedicating your time and your service, often our volunteers are going overnight. They give up every spare hour that they've got. And the great thing is, quite often the parents who land with us originally with challenges, as Lucy did, then become a volunteer. So there's a real outlet and there's a real sense of purpose that brings. But, honestly, if I could go around and hug every single volunteer, give them a massive pay situation, I would do it. But I think we're all here for the love. No one in small charities does it for the money, that's for sure.
No, well, exactly that. Although the money is one of the ways in which we can all send a message of appreciation and gratitude to people, because when they see the cheque arrive or when they hear about how much has been raised, it gives them a personal boost as well as, of course, the financial boost for the charity, which is why Make Some Noise supports families all over the country, funding projects like the one at Parenting Mental Health, which, as you've heard, works to train and empower people with lived experience of parenting a child with poor mental health to then support others in a way I think we've learned from Nikki and from Lucy, in a way that no one else can quite do. Families would not be able to get this help if it wasn't for the generosity of listeners like you. I mean you. And I've seen the difference that Make Some Noise brings to communities across the UK, to charities like Parenting Mental Health, possibly even to your community. So that's why we need your help today. And I want you to do it now. Because I know how tempting it is to think, oh yeah, all right, James, I'm busy, I'll do it later. And then you won't, you'll forget. So can you make a difference now? Can you do it now, right now? And whatever you give will make a difference to someone's life. Whatever you give. £40, £30, £20 or £10 or a lot more or less if you want to go to the website and just do what you can. If you want to donate 40, 30, 20 or £10, then just text LBC 40, LBC 30, LBC 20 or LBC 10, no spaces, to 70766. 100% of your donation will go to Global's Make Some Noise. You must be 16 or over, and please seek the bill payer's permission. Standard network charges may apply. As I said, you can go to lbc.co.uk for the T's and C's and for the opportunity to make a different donation, a different level of donation. Every penny counts, but in the simplest way, it's LBC 40, LBC 30, LBC 20 or LBC 10 with no spaces to 70766. That's 70766. Big thanks from Nikki Neal, the CEO of parenting, mental health, and a big thanks from everyone here at LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
7 minutes after 12, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That was one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. Did I hear that correctly? Honest Bob Jenrick in the news saying that he ordered the cartoons in the processing centre for unaccompanied child asylum seekers to be painted over because of people who pretend to be children when they're not, as in asylum seekers who pretend to. So you've got a 19-year-old from Iraq who is desperate for asylum in this country, so desperate that he's lied about his age, which doesn't happen anything like as often as I imagine, the British Values Brigade, we might call them loosely, claim that it does. But let's pretend it's a big problem. So if I understand Honest Bob correctly, so I am a 19-year-old Iraqi fleeing persecution in Iraq or Afghanistan. I get all the way to Dover. I tell them that I'm 16, 15, 14, 13, 12. I get into the asylum. I see a picture of Scooby-Doo on the wall, and I immediately say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I lied about my..." How on earth is painting over murals going to help catch people who are supposedly lying about their age? Did anyone ask him that? How would that work? So I walk into the asylum, I see a picture of Mickey Mouse, and I go, "Oh no, I accidentally sort of just cough your real age out. So paint over them, and then we'll catch them." Man alive, these people are extraordinary, aren't they? Okay, it's a weird one today, because I've got another one for you now that I think gets filed under substantive political conversation. I like this kind of thing. And don't let me down, because I don't know whether you were listening or not. If you weren't, you won't believe me. We had an absolutely fascinating conversation about tax in the first hour. I know what you're thinking. An absolutely fascinating conversation about tax in the first hour of the programme. And I'm going to turn your attention now to something else that the new government is keen to do. Tax doesn't have to be taxing is our new catchphrase today. We're going to get that on a T-shirt. I'm going to turn your attention next to another fairly big deal. So if Rachel Reeves does raise capital gains tax, it will be a significant political moment. It will be, I mean, I don't know how many people genuinely subscribe to the idea that they're all the same as each other. It's so obviously not true that I often wonder how much time I should spend addressing things that are obviously untrue. But then, of course, lots of people believe things that are obviously untrue. So you need to spend a little bit of time addressing it. But a raise to capital gains tax would be one thing. The focus moves now to Wes Streeting and a plan for waiting lists to be shredded by deploying private hospitals. So this is a £1 billion rescue plan to clear backlogs, and it would see the independent sector funding the biggest expansion in healthcare since the Blair government. So cancer checks, surgery, even intensive care for NHS patients would increasingly take place in private hospitals under proposals submitted to the Treasury ahead of the budget. And that's proposals from the Health Department. A source has said that the government would grab with both hands any spare capacity to get NHS patients treated more quickly. I beg your pardon, it's not come from Wes Streeting. The plans have been submitted by private hospitals. So they're saying we can do this. We could treat up to 2.5 million more patients, and we could start within weeks. Now, Wes Streeting has made it clear that he is prepared to do this. Indeed, in principle, he's prepared to do this. And we know that the received wisdom is that you're going to have to temporarily use private hospitals in order to take proper bites out of these waiting lists. In England alone, NHS waiting lists are currently standing at 7.64 million. And of course, proper winter is just around the corner. Have you put the heating on yet, by the way? No, nor have we, actually. I did one day last week. There was just one day where it was particularly cold. But you're thinking about it, right? It's going to, you're not even thinking about it. I know it's financially dependent as well, but if money was no object, would you have the heating on now? If money was no object, would you have the heating on now? Anyway, we know that winter's on the way, and that makes everything worse, doesn't it, in so many ways. 7.64 million. Wes Streeting we know, considers the NHS to be broken. Waiting lists have gone up since this government achieved power. And the promise to carry out an extra 40,000 appointments is still pending. And this is a wonderful example of principle and pragmatism colliding. Because if I said to you that I hate the idea of somebody, the first hour of the programme was about creaming a little bit off the top, wasn't it? The idea that capital gains tax rates mean that you pay less in percentage terms on the stuff that you've just creamed off the top, the stuff that you get for nothing, the reward you get for having money. And you pay less of a percentage in tax on that money, the money you get as a reward for having money, than you do on what you earn. The people who go out to work every day pay a higher percentage in tax on what they earn going out to work every day than the people who are getting a financial reward for having money. They're getting given some money as a reward for having money. That sticks in my craw, morally, ethically. Even and I thought the best caller was probably the fella who is going to be hit by this and thinks that's quite right too. Because it is, it just makes sense. So I have a similar problem with the idea of someone creaming off the top of a healthcare transaction. I've got a similar problem with the idea of, my mum going in to get a new hip and a private hospital stepping into the breach because the NHS is creaking at capacity. So a private hospital pops up to do the operation and mum gets a new hip and I'm happy, but somebody somewhere gets a dividend on their investment. They get a reward of money as a reward for having money because they could afford to buy shares in, and some of the companies involved in this latest proposal would be Bupa, the Circle Health Group, and Care UK has written to the Chancellor and the Health Secretary as well, saying that more than £1 billion of private sector capacity could be invested into facilities for NHS patients. But these are profit-making companies, or these are companies that reward shareholders. So I find it fascinating, because what if the alternative was that mum didn't get a new hip? Do you see what I mean about the collision of pragmatism and principle? Practicalities, if you like, and principle. It's the 3 Ps. Practicalities, pragmatism, and principle. Try saying that when you haven't put your teeth in. Because if you said to me, look, your mum can have a new hip, but it's going to be done in a private hospital, which means somebody somewhere is going to get a reward of money as a reward for having money. Or your mum can't have a new hip, or she'll have to wait another year for a new hip. Who here can really say that you'd want your mum to wait another year for a new hip? You wouldn't, would you? So the Chomsky line is relevant here as well. You know the Chomsky line about privatisation. They defund and demoralise something that's publicly owned until it almost becomes a no-brainer that you're going to have privatisation. They defund and demoralise. We've had 14 years of that. We expect the Labour government to be different. But what if things are so bad that the only way out is temporary dependence upon the private sector? The people who get a reward of money as a reward for having money. The investors, the shareholders. I don't know the answer to that. So who's best qualified to contribute to this conversation? I don't even know the answer to that either. Which means we all are. Everyone's got a view on this. Private hospitals to rescue the NHS. A £1 billion proposal to clear waiting lists for 2.5 million patients. And they say they're good to go in weeks. I think Wes Streeting will be open to this idea. It means that the private sector would use its own staff and its own facilities, some of which would be newly built. And in return, I guess, the NHS would guarantee a certain level of business. He's already said that the government would go further than New Labour ever did in the use of the private sector for NHS patients. And I want you to tell me whether this is actually a moment where we've really got to hold on to our hats and remember what's important. And what's important is, well, what is important? Is it that there is no profit attached to the provision of healthcare in this country? I know that ship has already sailed in some ways, but that's why we're doing the 3 Ps, right? Principle, pragmatism, practicalities. Do we have to really give our heads a wobble and say, no, stop it. NHS is the most beautiful creation that this country has ever been responsible for, with the possible exception of the welfare state, two things that are, in essence, socialist. Because no one makes a profit out of them. Shareholders, at its inception, no one's creaming anything off the top of a welfare payment or an NHS treatment. But these waiting lists are millions of people long, millions upon millions of people waiting to be seen. The private sector is saying, we can help. We can do this. We're not going to do it for nothing. You're going to have to pay us. But we can do it. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I find it a perfect illustration of the dangers of prioritising principle over practicality, and a terrifying harbinger of what might happen if we abandon principle in pursuit of practicality. I don't think that there's a right answer to this question, as in, should this be done? But I want to know what your answer is. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I'll read this. I remember your original message, Leslie, actually, and it's the one that I thought of when I saw this front page this morning. It must be your way with words, because your story really stuck in my memory, really stuck in my mind, and I'll read it again. Leslie says, you read out my message a few months ago, James, about me paying against all of my principles for my grandson to have his tonsils removed. He was a constantly poorly little thing, and it was just so sad to see. The waiting list, even to see a consultant, was 2 years. So we took out a loan and paid. And 4 months on, he's at school, he's happy, he's thriving, and everything is completely wonderful. I know that there are tens of thousands of children, the future workers of this country, who are struggling like him. So yes, do whatever it takes to get people well and worry about it later. And Leslie describes herself as being as far to the left as it's possible to get. Except it's possible to get even further to the left, because there are people further to the left of Leslie who would cut off their grandson's nose to spite their face, who would say, no, I am not going to pay for you to go privately, because to do so is to betray my principles and to perhaps jeopardise the future of the NHS. I don't know. I'm just going to open the phone lines and invite you to call me on this. I'm not going to give you a specific question. You know the facts, you know the story, you know what we're talking about. What do you want to say? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 12. Manisha says, I'm pretty left, but we have to stop looking at the NHS through a rose-tinted pair of spectacles that Labour have paid for themselves. That was a good line in PMQs yesterday, when Rishi Sunak said something like, even Lord Ali wouldn't buy that. As an idea, as in believe something. But I don't know. I just want to know what you think. Private hospitals to rescue the NHS is the headline, and I suppose if I wasn't so long-winded, I could just have said, what's not to like? Meaning that, not in a rhetorical sense, as in literally, what is not to like about this? Alison's in Crawley. Alison, what would you like to say?
Hi, thanks, James. This is exactly how the Blair government and Alan Milburn dealt with the backlog, back in post-1997. And the reason you do it is because if you build up, if we just take, say, hip replacements, just as an example, if you build up sufficient capacity to deal with the backlog, then when you've dealt with the backlog, you will have surplus capacity for the average amount that comes in on a monthly, yearly basis.
Oh, yeah?
That's a really expensive thing to do. Yeah. So you don't do it. You deal with the backlog. You may need to increase capacity in some areas, and that's an assessment that needs to be made, but you don't increase the capacity to deal with the backlog unless you absolutely have to. So you use the private sector, and what we used to do then, as I was non-executive director of a trust then, we would have contracts for, 50 hip replacements with a local provider. They would generally be what I would call the non-complex cases, so people who didn't have additional conditions like diabetes or a heart condition or whatever. Yes. And they would be done in the private sector. But in terms of who got done in the private sector, just the next person off the top of the NHS waiting list.
Why does it make sense for the private sector then to have the capacity that will not be needed when the waiting lists have been reduced?
Well, back then,
Yes.
there was a standing conference on what to do about waiting lists in private medicine, because the number one reason why people go private is because of waiting lists. So when you reduce the waiting lists, the business for the private sector plummets.
Yeah, so they are essentially just looking at the short-term gains then.
Yeah, they're making some money there, and
so they're jeopardising their business model in the long term in return for a short-term gain.
Yeah, they have the surplus capacity, and to them it's just business. In the Blair years, what they did ultimately was they started to diversify much more into things like health checks and elderly care.
Okay, so so it's a building's a building, isn't it? In a way, and what you were doing in it yesterday doesn't necessarily define what you would be doing in it tomorrow. So you pointing to the perceived success of what happened when Alan Milburn was Secretary of State for Health, took over from Frank Dobson, I think, didn't he? And,
That's right. Yeah.
And you would say that when I say what's not to like, you'd say nothing.
Well, absolutely. And actually, I think to increase capacity just to get rid of a backlog is pretty reckless.
Within the NHS, as in to build new facilities to deal with the waiting list. The waiting lists are dealt with, and you've got these white elephants, you've got these empty facilities.
So unless you've got a long-term plan for them, you were going to use them for this until the backlog's gone, and then we're going to use them to this. But you do need to be thinking strategically like that. You can't just increase your capacity for, hip replacements, get rid of the list and think that's fine.
It divided the party. It was between 2003 and 2010. The Telegraph describes it, and this is on the news pages of the Telegraph, which are still quite respectable, unlike the comment pages. The Telegraph writes that it divided the party, which I vaguely remember, and lost momentum. But in a way, if the waiting lists are being reduced, it will lose momentum, won't it? Because it's an emergency measure for an emergency situation.
Exactly, and you're delivering on the promise ultimately, which is what people want to see.
Is there any negatives at all, in your view?
I don't think so. I think that obviously there may be a sense of unfairness that, the lady down the road went to the private hospital and I had to go to I don't know. But, these are minimal issues, aren't they?
Yes.
If we're talking about getting people's healthcare sorted.
And how amazing is it that we are really just seeing history repeat itself, is that the Labour Party is inheriting an NHS in crisis and is therefore dedicated to fixing the crisis. And this is one way of fixing the crisis, and it has a precedent because it's one of the ways in which they fixed the last crisis that they inherited in 1997.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Alison.
Déjà vu.
No, well, isn't it? Yeah, all over again. It is coming up to 12:30. A squeeze in Veronica, who's in Sutton. Veronica, what would you like to say?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to quickly rebut what the comment the lady just made. Is because in the sense that absolutely we need to use private hospitals to capacity. Yeah. But the UK, or particularly England, has the lowest number of hospital beds per 1,000 of the population. I'll just give you two quick stats.
Of course.
The UK has like 2.3 beds per 1,000 of the population, compared to Germany, which is just under 8.
So you're saying there is a case for increasing capacity within the NHS?
Absolutely. The average across Europe is 5.
But that doesn't. You're right to make that point. I've seen those statistics, and they're pretty jarring. And like everything else, it's a situation that's got worse since 2010. But in terms of getting the waiting lists down as soon as possible.
Yeah, we have to go. You just got to do the private route. And the second point is, I worked for 20 years in the pharma industry, and your comment leading up to, well, why should the private sector profiteer from my mum's getting a hip operation? Yeah. I worked in the cancer, for developing cancer drugs, and they're some of the most expensive therapies. And unfortunately, I have to say this as somebody who used to work in the pharma. I don't work with them anymore.
Sure.
That the pharma industry makes billions off the back of sickness.
Yes.
So, if you were to say, from an ethics perspective, I'm not going to go to the private hospital, then you'd have to stop taking anything that only take generic drugs that have lost their patent. Because any patent drug that's come out in the last...
No, I know. But but I'm describing the NHS in its current form and the prospect of it changing and becoming more reliant upon private health. It's not an argument against that to say that the pharmaceutical industry already involves profiteering.
Yeah. Which it does, and that's
I know that. I know. Well, you could use that as a warning of what might happen to the NHS if we go too far down this road.
But I think what we should do is we should be using the private sector now just as a bit of an emergency for the next couple of years, and God willing, this Labour government pumps up and brings the UK at least back up to the EU average.
If only those 40 hospitals Boris Johnson kept banging on about had actually existed, had actually been built. And you're right, it is. We are below the EU average on beds. And of course, you add bed blocking into that, the fact that we have a particular problem with people in hospital beds who shouldn't be because there's nowhere for them to go as a consequence of the social care crisis, and things are probably even more severe than Veronica describes. I need someone to be against this. And I know that would involve, in a sense, prioritising principle over practicality, and that's a tricky position to pursue. But I think it's an important one. Your voice needs to be heard. But first, Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:34. I was going to do a little bit. I was hoping to amuse you by pretending to be outraged that I haven't won the Nobel Peace Prize again. But given that, as you'd expect, the recipients are incredibly worthy and rightfully so, I don't think that would have landed very well in comedy terms. So I'm glad I didn't do that. I'm still holding out for Rear of the Year, though. Is that still a thing? I can't believe I've never actually landed Rear of the Year. It's years since I won any awards. I must be due something. Yeah, I know that I'd also win that one as well. 12:34 is the time. I like this. This conversation. It's so fascinating. So there's sort of lots of disagreement, but very polite. It'll never catch on. Chantel says, I'm curious about your stance on this, James. Do you think it's a good idea, effectively using the private sector to prop up and ease the burden on the NHS? If so, I wonder why something similar can't apply to independent schools. Some sort of partnership with the state system. Alternatively, I don't understand why, if taxing the private sector is a good idea, the same does not apply to private healthcare. What am I missing? And this from Ellen. I've used private healthcare. I got diagnosed with my autoimmune by going private. I felt awful for going private. I've since realised that if you have the means to go private, you are freeing up a space for someone who doesn't have the means in the NHS. Please tell people it's not against liberal principles to go private if you have the means to do so. It actually supports liberal principles by helping those in greater need than yourself. You remove yourself from the waiting list. To answer Chantel's question, that there are not 7 million children currently unable to go to school, so that you don't have waiting lists. And therefore the parallel is not quite as powerful as it might otherwise be. But yeah, you're right. It's a lot more nuanced than you'd realise, or than perhaps I have previously acknowledged in the past. And maybe that's the problem. That's where I worry about Chomsky. That's where I worry about that line of Chomsky's about how you defund and demoralise something that's essentially, that is publicly owned, so that it becomes almost a no-brainer that you then go private in order to help alleviate the situation, to help fix things. And that's where, as often happens with these conversations, the question of the guarantee that it would be a temporary tactic is probably the most important element of the entire political proposal. 12:36 is the time. Teresa is in Coventry. Teresa, what would you like to say?
Well, I have a huge issue over the taking the, whether it's a priority and principle.
Yes.
I totally support the principle of a fully funded National Health Service.
Yes.
What hasn't been mentioned so far is huge tranches of the NHS are already privatised.
That's true.
One of my sort of favourite ones I always tell people about is the blood bank service.
Go on.
That was sold off by the Tories to a company who then sold it off and made a huge profit. So, the NHS is
largely private, and people don't realise it's not
largely is pushing it, but I think a lot of people don't. I mean, you can see it on the side of ambulances sometimes, can't you? You see that the ambulance is run by a private company. So yeah, you're absolutely right to remind us that it's already baked into the NHS, as it were.
It is baked in. The cleaners, the porters, etc.
Yes.
Amazing how many staff were actually privately employed.
Yes.
But going back to the debate in question,
yes,
our country is not poor. We have a 40 billion minimum tax gap. That's the gap between what should be paid in tax and what is collected. That's according to HMRC.
Mm-hmm.
Independent analysts reckon it could be as much as 100 billion.
Yes.
And I thought remind people that there was the Panama Papers, there's all this offshore tax havens, etc., etc. There's a lot of money available that, if government was determined, could find to fund public services. As far as the current crisis is concerned, I think you said the last crisis was 1997. Well, that was inherited. I'd like to say that the last real crisis was the COVID crisis. And during the COVID crisis, private hospitals were taken over.
You've made me feel pedantic, Teresa. We're talking about the waiting list crisis being solved by deployment of private sector.
Yes, I'm coming to that point.
Okay, but that's why we were talking about Alan Milburn in 2010. I don't think anyone disputes the idea that COVID was a crisis.
No, I know that.
Sorry.
But during that crisis, the private sector was taken over by the NHS and was run to meet the needs of the NHS. I think that that's what should happen in the current state of affairs. We have to use the private sector, much as I hate the idea that this is what we have to do.
Yes.
If we don't, we're going to have people who are going to be suffering for ages. There are people now who desperately need hip replacement, etc., who are not getting treated because of the state of the NHS. We need to properly invest in the NHS.
And how can we be confident? Because that's the point, isn't it? It's not either or. How can we be confident that it will be a temporary solution to a temporary crisis?
Well, we used the private hospitals on a temporary basis during COVID. And it was returned. They were returned back to the private sector at the end of what was considered the crisis point. So the worry about whether or not it's temporary is, and it's going to become permanent or whatever, I think it's
a red herring almost.
Is an argument. Yes, it is a red herring.
Yeah, you're right. So, I mean, in a way, what about my Chomsky fears then? That's partly the same red herring, actually, isn't it? The idea that this would presage a permanent state of affairs where it clearly wouldn't, because the capacity is dedicated to reducing a 7.64 million strong waiting list. And then when the waiting list isn't there, the capacity isn't needed.
Well, I think actually if we don't deal with the NHS properly and fund it properly, that capacity issue is going to rear its ugly head again.
And we trust a Labour government. We trust a Labour government to recognise that and act on it much more than we would a Conservative government.
Well, absolutely. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The Conservatives, I think, would prefer us to have an American-style health system.
Of course they
Certainly, there's been plenty of sort of written and spoken evidence on that score.
Yes,
but
and I'm sure there's a Tufton Street think tank popping up any minute now to tell us why that is actually for the best. That is without telling us who pays their wages. I just to clarify one thing, I think I misspoke slightly about Bupa. That Richard tells me they don't have shareholders. They're a private company limited by guarantee who reinvest their profits. But that's just a detail. It's not relevant to what Teresa is saying. So we like this. We wish it wasn't necessary. We acknowledge that it is, and we don't worry unduly about it signalling any sea change in health provision in this country, with the constant caveat that we need proper investment in the permanent NHS.
Yes, absolutely.
What's your interest? You sound very knowledgeable. Is it your field of expertise or experience, or are you just
No. I was a parliamentary candidate back in 2019, did a huge amount of research on it.
Okay.
And the way I feel about it is sort of a bit contradictory but I actually put pragmatism over principle on this particular case.
Yeah, I think I do too with health. No, because what's the alternative? Can I ask what party you were running for or not?
Labour.
Okay, didn't happen. Why didn't you have another go?
I don't like the current leadership.
I'm glad I asked, but you recognise that Wes Streeting is probably going to play this one correctly.
Yes, unfortunately so, and a lot of my fellow socialists don't agree with me.
No, I can see that, but that's why it's very important to zone in on the conflict between practicality, pragmatism, and principle, isn't it? Because
it's easy to talk about principle if you're not the person suffering.
Yeah, it's not your mum that needs a new hip. Thank you, Teresa. I enjoyed that enormously. And Alan reminds us, of course, that COVID is still a crisis. That's something that is often overlooked in the coverage. Even Dominic Cummings, in the best spirit of a stopped clock, was making some powerful points the other day about the nature of it as an airborne disease and the continuing denial of that by people who I think really should know better. Thank you, Teresa. Gregor is in Brighton. Gregor, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome aboard.
Bear with me.
It's only me.
So I'm going to challenge some of the narratives you've been talking about so far. I'm kind of sitting on the fence on this. I come from a background of working in independent sector and the NHS.
Okay. And
so on the idea that a physiotherapist.
Okay.
So in literally thousands of hip and knee replacements. And I've had one myself in an independent sector.
Have you?
So I kind of sit in the middle on this. But to come to your points, I think I worry slightly about the idea that it's temporary.
Yes, so do I.
For a couple of reasons. If you look at the data from the National Joint Registry, which is a body that collects the number of hip and knee replacements done every year, has done for about 20-odd years, I'll read directly from it, and it shows that NHS-funded operations in facilities peaked in 2014.
Yeah.
Since COVID, they've dropped back down to 2007 levels. And then this year, I think this refers to last year, for the first time, the independent sector did more hip replacements than NHS hospitals. So NHS-funded hip replacements in independent sector. So that's not just a volume thing and a consistent trend that's been going on for the past 10 years or so, but it's also all the staff that go with that. So the consultants doing the operations are most likely NHS-trained employees that work in the NHS still. So if we take them away from the NHS trusts into the independent sector, then you take away...
Well, they often do both, don't they?
They do, yes, absolutely. But I imagine the incentives of doing more NHS-funded operations in independent sector brings with it certain rewards and appeal,
for sure.
and it obviously means they are not providing training opportunities to the junior doctors, the junior surgeons in those NHS facilities. Perhaps they also do on-call trauma lists, and therefore they may choose to do less of those, and therefore if you get knocked down by a car or something and break your leg, perhaps you may end up waiting longer for those trauma-based operations in the NHS service.
This is, you're right, misery guts. This was all going so well. We were almost unanimous.
As well.
So
it's not just the surgeons, but it's also the nursing staff, the physio staff, the theatre practitioners, and all of those will sort of slowly continue, bearing in mind this has been going on for about 10 years, the trend will continue to sort of drift towards the private sector, and therefore the NHS continues to lose its capacity to perform these operations in the future if suddenly we've cleared the backlog and all of a sudden it wants to do them again. The skills and capacity are not there.
I mean, you raise valid concern, very, very valid concerns. The simplistic response is that if the waiting list is currently 7.64 million, then when it is 0.64 million, a few years hence, fingers crossed, touch wood, all the rest of it, then the problem you describe would not be as big as we might fear, but the dangers of the whole system almost having recalibrated according to the popularity of private treatments would be quickly reversed, wouldn't it?
Exactly that, and quite possibly those theatre facilities that, let's say, were currently being used for hip and knee replacements will then be taken over by other services, because the NHS doesn't just have an endless selection of theatres to be using. They will get used up by other services and other specialties that are competing for them. And another point on that is I don't necessarily think, even if we get the list right down, that demand will necessarily drop on the background of an ageing population.
Well, this is very...
Demand for these things. I'm still talking. Stop talking over me. What?
No, I'm talking over you. How dare you interrupt me when I'm interrupting you? No, you're right. Is that it's denying demographics almost, isn't it? Like a lot of politics does at the moment.
Can I make one other point as well? I think it's really
not
important
really.
too.
You're very late. Can you do it in 14 seconds flat?
40 seconds, yes. Imagine your mum. Imagine she's very frail and she lives alone and she has no social support afterwards. A private independent sector hospital may refuse her because of the complications trying to discharge her from the independent sector and say, no, you're too complicated. You need to go back to the NHS sector that can more easily access this care. So the most vulnerable, most frail people that need the
that's your lot. Get over there. Wait, 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
One is the time. I've said to you a few times, haven't I? I never know how much attention to dedicate to this stuff. But the people who believe bonkers things are probably more powerful now, politically speaking, on both sides of the Atlantic than at any point in recent history. And every now and then I stumble across an example that merits repetition, that is worth sharing with you. So there's a rather splendid American operation that does sort of similar work to what we do with the occasional caller. They're called the Good Liars, and they go to Donald Trump events, they go to Donald Trump rallies and have conversations with real people, right? Politically engaged people who support Donald Trump. And here is I don't know if favourite is quite the right word, but here is a recent example.
What do you think happened with the hurricanes?
I think there was an upcoming storm, and then I think government set in with whatever it is that they do. I don't know all the specifics about it. I'm not an expert in cloud seeding or whatever it is that they use to magnify the storm to a higher degree to disturb a land that maybe wanted for lithium that Harris's husband is partaking in,
So they made the storm stronger, so it would hit the.
This one.
You think that Milton, they're making it stronger?
From a 2 to immediately to a 5, like instantaneously.
You're implying that the government made a hurricane stronger to hurt its own country, the United States of America?
Correct.
And what would be the gain of that?
If like there's been people out there, if they have an Alexa, I don't know if you've heard that, and they've asked what caused Milton.
Okay.
You can go on there now. It's already predicted the number of deaths and the amount of it's already predicted it. On a Google, it won't do that. If you ask it about Helene, it'll tell you the government actively used seed clouding. This is before Helene even happened.
Why would a country want to have a hurricane be strong and hit its own country?
Because they want to control certain places. And if you're looking at where the hurricane's going, it's a lot of red states. If you're looking at the counties in North Carolina that were hit, there were all of them, 26 out of 28 of those counties were for Trump. They're doing whatever they can because they can't rig the election.
Even control the weather?
Yes.
So we've reached the bit where the people who deny man-made climate change claim that the government is actually creating hurricanes. And these are not fringe in terms of numbers. This is now a commonplace position among, well, you can see it on social media, but there it is in real life. I just thought you'd find that simultaneously terrifying and hilarious. I want to draw your attention next to something rather more immediately serious. I really stress this point, that you might not know. Listen, if I'm talking about you, you don't need to listen to the next bit. But if you don't have anything going on in your life that is traumatic or deeply troubling, you almost certainly know someone who does. In fact, if you're in company at the moment, if you're in work, then there's probably someone you can see right now who is at home going through stuff that is close to unbearable. And it will often involve the mental health of loved ones, most obviously children. That is why Global's Make Some Noise, LBC's charity, works with small local projects across the UK to help those facing life's toughest challenges. It might be helping families living with a life-limiting diagnosis. It might be actual loss. It might be a family that's lost someone they love. It could be homelessness. Or it could just be someone struggling deeply with the pain of feeling alone. Someone like Jochebed.
I was 17, turning 18. I was like, okay, I think I need to talk to someone, but I don't know how to express emotions. I was very quiet, always trying to make people laugh and stuff, hiding my pain. I was always someone that bottled everything up, and, the counselling service made everything even better than it was, because that's how I learned to communicate. Without it, I don't think I would have finished college. My mum and dad, they're constantly telling me how proud they are of me. Big Kid has definitely saved me, and they've saved my family.
And there it is. There's the difference that Make Some Noise can make. And it's things you don't know you need until you need them. Things that you don't even know exist until you need them. And those are the charities that the Make Some Noise team work tirelessly all year round to identify and support. And that's why I'm asking for your help today, okay? And do it now. You can transform someone's life. You can reach someone like Jochebed in this moment by texting LBC 40, LBC 30, or LBC 20, no spaces. That's LBC 40, LBC 30 or LBC 20 to donate 40, 30 or £20, and send that text now to 70766. That's the number you need, 70766. 100% of the donation goes to Global's Make Some Noise. 16s and over only, please. Seek your bill payer's permission, and standard network charges may apply. Or you can donate what you can afford online and find the full terms and conditions at makesomenoise.com. Thank you, actually, not just from me, from everyone at LBC, everyone at Global, everyone at Make Some Noise. And I think most importantly, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone that you will be helping by making that donation. It's just coming up to 12:57. This week's podcast guest is a bit of a one. It's William Dalrymple, the historian, author of a brilliant new book called The Golden Road. He's also, I think, the first person on Full Disclosure that I went to the same school as, although not at the same time. But I can tell you for nothing, my background's nowhere near as posh as his.
I have only one talent, which is the one I've spent my life sort of milking, if you like, which is writing. And I had no talent for anything like maths, chemistry, biology, anything other than actually writing essays. So I got very ordinary results as a kid, and even in my O-levels were completely unexceptional. It was only at A-level that I showed I could do this one thing, which it's a lucky thing to have one thing you can do really well, rather than being a generalist that can do a bit of everything. So once is a gift.
The essay opened itself to you, you found your feet.
But the one thing, while I wasn't regarded as clever or precocious or a superstar in any conceivable way, I was always interested in history, and that was always there.
Do you remember the earliest sort of stirrings?
Absolutely. I was crazy. The first thing that really got me was ancient Egypt. As any kids, I mean, lots of kids had this, mummies and all the rest of it, canopic jars and all those movies about Doctor Who going into the pyramids and that kind of stuff. I loved all that. And my first trip to England, I wasn't quite true. I should say, amid this very sort of privileged background, one of the other privileged things I had was a nanny. The difference was that my nanny was a sort of Fenian who... I'm not making this up. She took me down, I remember, age 6, to North Berwick Library to show me Cecil Woodham-Smith's book on the potato famine and how the English had let the Irish starve to death. And there were pictures of cannibalism that I have in my mind's eye to this day, of mothers eating their babies. That was that the English made them eat them. And so...
That would stick in the memory.
And she brought me up with... So on one hand, I had my... dad's world, which was Sword of Honour at Sandhurst and that sort of stuff. On the other hand, I had, which is rather more close, I mean, I spent more time with my nanny probably than my parents in the early childhood. And she was full of stories of Robert the Bruce running away from the English and hiding in the cave and try again, and the redcoats burning the Highlands and pillaging the Highland clearances. I got all this by the age of 5 or 6. And so I remember very clearly the first time I went to England. And she had a cousin just over the border in Northumberland. And she'd made the English had.
Terrifying. They're gonna eat you.
Like it was Mordor or something. And I think we can't have gone more than 10 miles into England over the Northumberland border, which is the most, you go there today, it's the most benign countryside on that A1 down the coast, with the North Sea looking beautiful to one side. But it happened to be crop burning. And as soon as we crossed into England, all the fields were on fire, smoke rising up, and it literally was. It was like Mordor, expected orcs.
You might know William from his podcast, of course, the Empire podcast, which is brilliant. But you might not know much about him, which is why I enjoyed Full Disclosure so much this week, as I do every week. I've run out of time, speaking of podcasts. I've run out. I can't do my banter with the newsagents, who have been very kindly trying to get me a jingle made for to fill a space that is unforgivably absent on this programme. We're very short of jingles, but I'll do that on Monday. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. For example, Full Disclosure and indeed The Newsagents. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.